Hey there everyone, Doggin Days here, and today we're doing something a little different. Today I'll be recounting at length the events of my first year attending and playing in competitive Heroscape tournaments. Over the course of 2023, I attended 6 different community-organized Heroscape tournaments in my area, with each event varying in number of players and format rules. Aside from the joy of meeting and playing against other Heroscapers, I learned a lot about the game at each event and wanted to share my findings in video format. As you can see, it's a long one, and so I've broken it up into sections covering each event I attended. Each event section is then divided into the following subsections: format rules, tournament preparation and army selection, battle reports of the games I played each day, and the main lessons, discoveries, and other takeaways I gleaned from each event. Unfortunately, I didn't record any of the games I played, and so I had to rely on memory and a few pictures I took each day. Sometimes I remembered a lot from an event, sometimes not so much. But I always remembered the mistakes I made and the lessons I learned, and those are all things I wanted to share with you. Given the subject matter, this video is going to be my most personal so far on this channel, but I also wanted to use it to share some reflections about how my outlook on Heroscape has changed, both since I started this channel and since I started getting into competitive play. For the majority of my Heroscape life, I only played Heroscape with my immediate circle of friends, and was only a lurker in the broader community. I read the forums, knew the big names and major players, but never really engaged beyond that. But even as a lurker, for the longest time I thought I had a sound understanding of the mechanics of high-level Heroscape play. I read lots of strategy articles and threads on the forums, and generally thought I had a good grasp on what it meant to be a strong Heroscape player. But ever since I started more seriously engaging with the Heroscape community in my area beyond my close friends, I've been forced to reckon with the fact that I don't know nearly as much about this game as I thought I did, and am nowhere near the level of player I want to be. When I uploaded my first major video analyzing and ranking the units in the Rise of the Valkyrie Master Set, I wasn't going to tournaments or exposed to the most advanced levels of play. I tried to give the best analysis I could on my tier lists, but I realize now that I probably postured myself in those as a more advanced player than I actually was. Now, for anyone who enjoyed those videos, don't worry. They're still in the works for the other official waves of units, and I'll continue to give as deep and careful an analysis as I can for each unit I cover. But a big part of why I wanted to make this video was to give you all a sense of what my overall skill level in this game is, especially in a competitive setting. You'll hear about how I approached each event, my thought process behind drafting my armies, and my decision making during actual gameplay. With that, I hope I can offer some transparency about my strength, or lack thereof, in the game, so that you know how much salt with which to take my future tier list rankings and analysis videos. With yet another overlong intro out of the way, let's do this thing. Here are the stories of the competitive Heroscape events I attended in 2023. Sit back, relax, do whatever the heck it is you do when you listen to these insane videos, and let's dive in. February 11th, 2023. On February 11th, 2023, I went to my first competitive Heroscape tournament. This was the event I advertised in a video on my channel, hoping maybe a few of my audience back then might be in the area and able to attend. I'm keeping that video up on the channel for sentimental reasons, but the event itself ended up a small gathering of only 6 players, myself included. Still, the sheer prospect of finally playing the game I grew up with and adored throughout my life in a competitive setting had me plenty excited. Rules and format. As I recall, there were a lot of newcomers to our region's Heroscape group around the time of this event, including myself, and so the tournament rules were kept straightforward. 2-player games, 450-point armies at classic points, VC units allowed, no Marvel units. Some reasonable restrictions were in place. No more than 9 of the same figure were allowed in the same army, essentially meaning players could draft no more than 2 4-figure squads and no more than 3 3-figure squads into their army. And a player could draft into their army no more than 1 of the following units: Death Reavers, Major Q9, Mara Warriors, and Raylan the Kyrie Warrior from Rise of the Valkyrie, the 4 units ranked A+ on OEAO's power rankings on the Heroscapers forums. A player's army could also only take up 16 hexes worth of space, but this was easy to do with the figure limit. My army. Before I'd even joined this particular Heroscape group, I had long imagined my first tournament army to include the mighty Hive Lord Torkulna. The big Maro Bruiser checked several boxes in terms of things I was looking for in an army: high attack, squad crowd control, an auto wound power, and bonding. Torkulna's base stats and high survivability had always impressed me, but I was particularly focused on his ability to heal his own wounds through the Marden Nagrub's Hive Lord life bonding power. The idea of an opponent expending so much time, effort, and figures to get a single wound on so powerful a hero, only to have it undone the next turn, gave me not a small amount of schadenfreude. After weighing the options in my collection for an army for this event, I eventually decided to draft Torkulna and 3 squads of grubs, 9 total, the max allowed for this event. That would be enough to fully heal Torkulna once, with a few extra grubs left over for insurance. But it occurred to me that I could make each wound healed on Torkulna even more valuable if his already high defense of 5 was increased. Enter Raylin from Rise of the Valkyrie, who I decided would be my 1 A+ allowed unit for that tournament. I imagined that few attackers would be able to puncture a Raylin buff Torkulna's 7 defense, 8 if on height. In the unlikely scenario a few attacks did get through that, I'd just have Torkulna eat a nearby grub and heal his wounds right up. But this wasn't a new discovery. One of the episodes of the Casters of Valhalla podcast introduced me to the concept of a king/queen army, that being an army built entirely around the protection of a single extremely powerful hero. The most common and varied of these armies were greenscale warrior armies, designed around protecting their lizard king or queen, usually one of classic Heroscape's many mighty dragons. But the Torkulna Grubs build was also covered. In these builds, Torkulna, like the dragons in greenscale armies, must be protected at all costs, and Raylin was brought up as practically an auto-include to that end. Torkulna is so big, obvious, and important a target that he'll immediately draw an opponent's ire, and so the 7 defense Raylin provides him is essential to keeping him alive. With Raylin, Torkulna, and 3 squads of grubs at classic points, I was at 390 points for my army, with 60 left to go. Now was the time to decide my filler. I narrowed it down to 2 possible units, Samuel Brown and Zetacron. For several days leading up to the event, I was leaning towards Zetacron. His excellent 8 range, deadly shot, plus his immunities as a large Solborg hero were compelling arguments to bringing him along. But I thought a bit longer on it and compared him more closely to Samuel Brown. While Sam Brown had only 7 range, that was still very good. It's true that Sam Brown didn't have the attack ceiling potential Zetacron had, since he didn't have deadly shot. And Sam Brown was a lot more vulnerable to auto-destroy powers, since he was a medium-sized non-Solborg. But what made Sam just as compelling as Zetacron to me was the fact that he had the potential to kill 2 figures in one turn with his Fire and Rush special attack. Plus, in terms of raw life and defense stats, he arguably had overall higher survivability. Whether I went with Zetacron or Sam, my choice was there for filler, and likely endgame cleanup. Whatever was left behind from Torkulna's rampage, I would need either Zetacron or Sam Brown to mop up. Zetacron had high attack potential, but he could only ever attack 1 figure per turn. And that was ultimately why I chose Sam Brown. He just offered more for the scenario I imagined him in than Zetacron did. But I was always a little worried in the hours leading up to the event that I'd made the wrong call. Either way, the bulk of my army would be Torkulna and his protection, and I was eager to see what the Morrow Giant would accomplish. Performance notes and armies faced. With 6 players attending and the format set to round robin, I played a total of 5 games for the main portion of the event, 1 for each of the other 5 players. That meant 5 different armies for Torkulna and his grubs to face. Game 1. The first army I faced was an eclectic mix of Roman Legionnaires, Krav Maga agents, and Iskra Essenwein and her Wretchets of Bogdan. The Wretchets did successfully summon in, and I was definitely nervous as I started engaging my figures. One good attack from one of them could insta-kill Raylin. I don't remember that happening if it did, and with how much the Romans were inclined to bunch together for shield wall, they were set up well for Torkulna to stomp. I did win this game, and throughout most or all of it, I kept Torkulna well within Raylin's aura. Game 2. This was either the second or third game I played, I forget. But what I do remember was the army. It was a Greenscales army with Eldgrim the Viking Champion and the Morrow Warriors as filler. And on the board was a figure I had never seen before, a majestic golden dragon named Caligrith, one of the recent VC releases. At the time, I was still familiarizing myself with the VC roster, and so I hadn't ever seen Caligrith's figure or her card. When I took a look at her card, and its stats, I got nervous. This was gonna be a doozy. And it was. Eldgrim charged into the field with the Morrow Warriors not far behind. The warriors spread out across the map and went straight for my Raylin. They did a lot of damage on her, but I was lucky enough to kill them with Torkulna and his grubs before they killed her. I forget exactly what Eldgrim did, only that I had to kill him to get him out of my way. That turned out to be exactly my opponent's plan. As soon as Eldgrim died, he put his figure on Caligrith, granting the dragon his warrior's swiftness spirit and buffing her to 8 move with flying. This synergized beautifully with her Scorched Earth special attack, and while she was being protected by Greenscales, she flew around the board, burning my Grubs and Torkulna left and right. Torkulna was able to stomp a lot of Greenscales and got some attacks in on Caligrith. But when my injured Raylan finally bought the farm, Torkulna went down fast. Still, by the time he fell, Caligrith was badly wounded with 1 or 2 more Greenscales left to protect her. All I had was Sam Brown, and though he took some damage of his own, the Great Patriot shot Caligrith dead and survived long enough to kill the remaining Greenscales. I'd won by the skin of my teeth against a nerve-wracking, well-built army. In my mind, I thought, phew, at least I won't have to go up against that one again today. But the day was just getting started. Game 3. Once again, this was either the second or third army I faced that day, but it's one I still remember vividly. If I recall correctly, this army contained Marcus Decimus Gallus, 2 squads of Legionnaires, 2 squads of 10th Regiment of Foot, and Severus. I felt some confidence going into this match, as I had previously that day beaten a Romans build, and, coincidentally, on the very same map I was playing my new opponent on due to the randomizing of map assignments. But there were some new points of concern this time around. This new army was more synergistic and faster than the previous Romans army, thanks to Marcus. And I was very worried what the 10th Reg would accomplish if buffed by Marcus on height. Unfortunately for me, my confidence going into this match turned out to be overconfidence. I played very poorly. My opponent set up a strong position on height, with Marcus behind the 10th Regiment on a perch protected below by a screen of Romans. As Torkulna approached, he took a few hits, but was healing steadily and for the most part developing well. That is, until I made my first big miscalculation of the day. I was so tempted by the mass of squad figures that had huddled up together around height that I rushed Torkulna forward to get off some tramples. I got a couple, but not as many as I'd hoped with that charge. And most importantly, I'd foolishly rushed Torkulna out of Raylan's aura in pursuit of a trample opportunity. On my opponent's next turn, Torkulna got severely injured by 10th Reg fire. I tried my best to salvage the situation by healing Torkulna and moving Raylan up, but my opponent had made too much progress. Torkulna soon fell, and my leftover grub simply couldn't pick up the slack without him. I did kill a few more of my opponent's figures after Torkulna's death, but I lost that game, my first competitive tournament loss. Like all defeats, it was an experience I learned a lot from. Game 4. Next up, I faced a Heavy Gruts army, complete with Grimneck and, to my surprise, Ornak. It was nice to see Ornak getting some love in a competitive setting over Tornak, who cost the same amount of points. But I quickly learned why my opponent brought Ornak, so he could use his Red Flag of Fury to also activate Nigoxa, whom he'd also brought along in his army. And I knew what figure Nigoxa would be going for that game. Nigoxa did indeed go for Torkulna, and I was always stressed he'd get off a Mind Shackle. But Torkulna was also the best option I had to puncture Nigoxa's high defense, so the confrontation was inevitable. I managed to kill Grimnak early with Torkulna, and after some prolonged fighting, dropped Nigoxa too. I'd heard the best way to counter Torkulna is to engage him from multiple points, so that anytime he'd try to do his Trample Stomp power, he'd likely be taking multiple disengagement attacks. And that's exactly what my opponent did. Heavy Gruts surrounded my Hive Lord from multiple angles. But rather than chance the disengagement, I decided to learn from my first loss that day and simply stay put. The Heavies had lost Grimnak and didn't have height on Torkulna, so there wasn't too much danger of Torkulna going down. By not giving in to the temptation to trample, Torkulna tanked the rest of the game and killed the remaining figures. Certainly, had Nigoxa shackled Torkulna, the game would have gone very differently, but in this timeline at least, I tucked that game in as another win for the day. Game 5. The last of the main set of games for that day, my Hive Lord and I found ourselves up against another Greenscales army, the classic Nilfheim Greenscales combo. I recall this army also sporting Atlaga the Kyrie Warrior and the Morrow Warriors. Overall, a serious proposition. The last time I faced Greenscales, I only barely won. The map was a mix of fortress and lava, with small rock safe zones nestled in the lava for figures to set up on height. Our two bonding armies advanced steadily, with our heavy hitters stalking the board for their moment to move in. I recall the Morrow Warriors grabbing glyphs early on, but I managed to keep them at bay with some grubs that broke away from my main force. The first major play of the game was when my opponent moved in Atlaga, who aimed straight for Torkulna with his Bolt of the Witherwood power. My heart pounded against my chest during the roll, but fortunately for me, it failed and Torkulna survived. Then came Nilfheim, who'd been blasting my units with Ice Shard on the sidelines, only to now rush forward and secure one of the rocky safe zones amid the lava. There were lava field hexes adjacent to him that would grant me height attacks on him, but I'd need to be careful about leaving my figures there lest they get burned at the end of the round. When playing Torkulna Grubs with Raylin, one of the key decisions a player has to make is when to spend an order marker to position Raylin. And I recall misjudging a Raylin positioning in the mid-game. I'd sent Torkulna out of her aura to deal with some greenscales, and now I had to get her set up again. But anywhere I could place her to reposition her aura wouldn't give me an opportunity to attack with her. There was, however, one spot I saw, on lava, that did. A small single-space lava perch adjacent to Nilfheim. I moved Raylin there, thinking it would also put Torkulna into her aura. But I'd forgotten that Raylin needs to see her allies in order to buff them, and Nilfheim's massive wings blocked her entire vision. Still, I decided to make the move. It was important that I did some kind of damage on that turn to stunt my opponent's momentum. I plopped Raylin on the perch and attacked down on Nilfheim, doing surprising damage. Maybe that was an ill-advised play, but in that game at least, it paid off. The rest of the details are fuzzy, but I recall Nilfheim dying before Torkulna. I believe Raylin died on lava as well, and Torkulna ate up the remainder of his grubs. There were one or two more Morrow warriors and a few greenscales left, but Torkulna made short work of them. The battle could have gone either way with how the mid-game played out, but I managed to pull another win on the greenscales. Game 6. With my score that day 4-1 win-loss, I advanced to the championship game. And my fears were realized. My opponent, the other high scorer that day, was the Greenscales Caligrith army, the one I'd only barely defeated. The map we were on had a large elevated center, meaning my forces would have to hike a bit to get set up well. I was nervous, but told myself if I could beat it once, I could beat it again. Would I come in first place on my first tournament? Once the game started, glyphs were revealed on the two hilltops on either side of the map. One of them was the glyph of Kelda, the healing glyph. Both my opponent and I had massive figures around which our armies were based, so controlling that glyph became critical. But I must not have appreciated that, because when I saw my opponent moving his greenscales to the center of the map, I moved Torkulna in to try to trample. Unfortunately, I'd fallen into a trap. My opponent locked Torkulna into place with his greenscales. I held my ground and took out several, but not far behind was Caligrith. She flew in and engaged Torkulna. The two duked it out with Caligrith approaching death. In a move I hadn't anticipated, the wounded Caligrith then disengaged from Torkulna and flew to the Kelda glyph, instantly healing all wounds. Even if Caligrith took the leaving engagement damage, she had enough lives to survive. There was little chance for me to salvage the game at that point. I fought to the bitter end, killing what I could. I recall being left with Sam Brown, hiding behind a ruin and getting killed by some remaining greenscales. It was my most crushing defeat of the day, brought on largely by my misplays. There were so many smarter plays I could have made to even that game out, like sending out grubs to double-space deny Caligrith from taking the Kelda glyph, and keeping Torkulna on height. In the end, I placed second out of 6 players. I'd come tantalizingly close to first place on my first tournament, but second place wasn't so bad. Takeaways and conclusion. I think everyone who plays Heroscape ends up discovering specific armies or builds they like to run, and I always enjoy seeing what units individual people gravitate to. One of my friends loves the Guard class, another friend of mine loves the Morrow, and on that day, I realized how fun and challenging I found the Torkulna Grubs with Raylin build. I enjoy the spectacle of a whole army devoted to protecting a single powerful figure on a map, and the Grubs offer the build tremendous flexibility. Among the things I learned is that, generally, Torkulna Grubs is a slow-rolling army. It's almost always necessary to keep Torkulna and his Grubs in Raylin's aura, and to protect Raylin from getting sniped early on. Raising the Grubs' defense from 2 to 4 means that weak attacks from the opponent's squads don't always kill them, and raising Torkulna's defense from 5 to 7 ensures a kind of controlled bleeding when he's assailed by enemy attacks from all sides. Because Torkulna can only ever heal 1 wound per turn, it's important to prevent your opponent from doing more than 1 wound of damage on him per turn, and Raylin is crucial to this. In both games I lost, I hastily rushed Torkulna out of Raylan's aura to go for some early kills, and in both cases, Torkulna was quickly dropped from repeat attacks. I'd learned that your entire game can hinge on deciding when to spend that turn on positioning Raylin. Time it right, and it pays huge dividends. Time it wrong, and you could be in a world of hurt. The other reality I had to learn the hard way is that likely does not mean certain. It's tempting to look at a d20 reliant power on a card and, if its parameters mean a successful roll is likely, then assume you'll just get it every time you attempt it. But that's folly. Much smarter, I think, is to assume you'll never get it, even if it's likely. Torkulna is especially punished for making bad d20 plays with his Trample Stomp power. It's true that if you can chain it, Torkulna can trample entire formations of squad figures, but Torkulna's movement ends the moment trample fails, and if it fails when Torkulna is in a vulnerable position, then he's stuck there. I've come to see Trample Stomp as a nice bonus, but not the linchpin of your strategy. Attempt trample only if, after successfully trampling, you wouldn't compromise Torkulna's position, and attempt it such that if you fail, Torkulna is left in a manageable position as well. I've actually found Torkulna, even with his high cost of 220 points, can sometimes earn those points just by holding his ground and dropping his normal attacks of 6 on the opponent. So long as you can control the wounds he's taking by keeping him in Raylan's aura, and position your grubs carefully to ensure at least one is adjacent to him at the end, Torkulna can tank entire games. It's a build that greatly rewards smart plays and severely punishes bad ones. Needless to say, after that first tournament, I was hooked on competitive Heroscape. Final score, 4-2, win-loss. March 11th, 2023. The next event I went to was held on March 11th, 2023. It was once again composed of 6 players, myself included, at the same game store we visited last time. Rules and format. This time, our group played the Monster Mash format, where the majority of one's points must be spent on large and/or huge figures. The point limit was 690 points, with no more than 145 available to spend on small or medium figures. To the best of my memory, we did classic points, and also imposed the restriction of no more than one of the A+ units on OEAO's power rankings. As a refresher, those are Old Raylin, Q9, Death Reavers, and Mara Warriors. And again, no Marvel was allowed, though technically there weren't any Marvel figures priced under 145 points, and all official Marvel are medium-sized, so they were effectively banned on points alone. My army. I confess that I didn't take many notes on this tournament and don't remember a lot about it, but I do remember my army. With the Monster Mash format, I realized there weren't as many opportunities for bonding, like what I had enjoyed with Torkulna Grubs in the previous tournament. That was, at least, until I remembered the Arrowgruts, who bond with 2 powerhouse huge figures, Mimring and Krug, and their main support unit, the Swag Rider, was, indeed, a large figure. Looking at the points, if I drafted 3 squads of Arrowgruts, I'd only have spent 120 points on medium figures, with enough to squeeze in 3 Swag Riders, Krug, and Mimring, all of whom could bond with them. While I didn't expect the Arrowgruts themselves to do much damage, their bonding flexibility with a powerful ranged character like Mimring and a beatstick like Krug sold me on the build. I thought, if anything, I'd use the Arrowgruts and Swag Riders for cleanup after Krug and Mimring did the heavy lifting of a battle. But even with those points, I still had 220 left to spend. My mind went hastily to the most expensive figures I could afford with that price. Jotun was just out of reach points-wise, and Torkulna didn't make any sense without his grubs. That left me with the next 2 expensive figures, both great dragons of classic Heroscape, Braxis and Charos. In this format, where there would be few if any smaller medium figures, Charos was the obvious choice, since large and huge figures are immune to Braxis' acid breath. I also thought Charos would be a nice all-purpose meat sponge that would play well into matchups with other powerful large huge figures I might face, with Counter-Strike to boot. With my last 10 points, I threw in Isamu and finalized my army. Performance notes and armies faced. And so came the Monster Mash. I would play 5 games against 5 different armies just like last time to see if I qualified for the championship game. As mentioned, I don't remember a lot about this event. In fact, I only remember details on 4 of the armies I faced, and incomplete details at that. But there were still plenty of takeaways from it all at the end. Game 1. The only details about this match that I recall were that it contained Ornak, Othkarek the Black Dragon, and Major Q10. Since the army had Ornak, I know it had at least one other Utgar-aligned hero in it besides Othkarek. Despite not having any Orc warriors to bond with, Ornak struck me as a clever choice for Monster Mash, with all of Utgar's many powerful large and huge figures. I remember this game being very close overall, with a critical moment coming on a defense roll of Q10s. Had Q10 survived that, I think the game could have gone very differently than it did. I managed a narrow victory and was shocked at how tough it was with the army I had built. One of the things I immediately discovered was Charos may not have been the best use of 210 points for the format. Both Othkarek and Q10 had ranged special attacks that would bypass Charos' counterstrike. After that first match, I realized that many powerful large huge figures possessed special attacks, rendering counterstrike useless and negating a huge amount of Charos' value. Had I brought the wrong army to this event? Game 2. While I still don't perfectly remember this match, it's the one I remember the most from this day. My opponent brought 2 VC units I was unfamiliar with, Major J15 and a bunch of Hoplotrons. Marching alongside them were Q9 and the Krav Maga agents. I forget the exact number of Hoplotrons present in the army, but it was overall very well built. It included Major X17 and had bonding flexibility with him via the Hoplotrons. The Hoplotrons could also activate J15, since he was technically a melee Soulborg with a base range of 1, even despite his guided cannon special attack. And Q9 and the Krav are threats no matter where they show up. Our 2 armies developed quickly onto the main hill of the map. I got a lucky early kill on a Krav Maga with a shot from one of my Arrogruts on height, but things got challenging fast as the Hoplotrons began moving in. Their high base defense and shield push power made them a real nuisance and gave them a staying power on the map I was impressed with. J15 developed behind them, firing the occasional guided cannon into my ranks. But Krug and Mimring were developing on my side, and I soon sicked the mighty troll onto the enemy Soulborgs. I remember Krug taking out J15 and significantly wounding Q9 before dying, so parting with him wasn't quite as painful as it could have been. I forget much of what Mimring did that game, but where the entire game hinged was on a duel between Charos and the wounded Q9. All I needed was one good attack into Q9 to drop him, but Q9 had his Queglix gun special attack. I remember Charos also had to take some disengagements from Hoplotrons as I approached Q9. Q9 and Charos engaged and fought for a few turns, but in the end, King Charos just couldn't down the Major. With Charos, Mimring, and Krug dead, I had little else to fight Q9 with. The Soulborgs mopped up the rest of my units and handed me my first defeat of the day. I was once again confronted with the fact that special attackers run right through Charos' counterstrike, and gained newfound respect for the Hoplotrons. In terms of intensity and closeness, this was the best and most interesting game I played that day. Game 3. This is the point of the day where the events of the tournament really become a blur in my memory. My next game was against an army with the great VC dragon Quahan in it. That's all I remember. In fact, I think I remember this match more for the beautiful sculpt of Quahan that was brought to the game than anything in the game itself. My opponent had ordered a 3D printed Quahan that I remember had a gorgeous, high contrast paint job that really brought out her blue coloration. Cool figure. Sadly, I didn't win this one. I do remember my opponent playing well, and that Quahan, man. Cool figure. Game 4. My next game was against an army containing a few squads of Marden Hounds. I had a feeling these guys would show up somewhere that day. They're the perfect Monster Mash squad as large figures with great survivability and an auto-wound power via Marrow Plague. Just like the last game though, I only remember this one unit for certain. I believe my opponent had at least 2 or 3 squads of hounds, and may have even brought Torkulna without grubs. Once again, I don't remember much about this game. I did manage to win it, so my losing streak was over. Maybe if I won the next game, I could qualify for the championship. Game 5. Sadly, I remember nothing about this final game. The only thing I remember that day was my final score, which was 3 wins, 2 losses. This last game was one that I won, but I don't remember what I faced. And unfortunately for me, I was knocked out of the championship. I believe the championship was between the Quahan army and the Hoplotrons, who'd both just scored a bit higher than me for the day. I believe the Quahan army won, and I wasn't unhappy to see such a lovely figure take first place. Takeaways and conclusion. I've already alluded to the biggest lesson I learned that day. When one expects to go up against special attackers, Charos isn't the best use of 210 points. Certainly Charos is more attractive in a standard double-blind format, where there's a greater possibility your matchups will contain more normal attackers he can counterstrike on. But in Monster Mash, there were just too many special attackers I was likely to face to justify Charos, and I should have anticipated that when building my army. If anyone knows of a case where Charos can or has done well in a Monster Mash format, I'd love to hear some more stories. But my conclusion that day was those 210 points would have been better spent on something more versatile. The other main takeaway was how very little the Arogrettes themselves did to influence the fights I found myself in. Their weak attacks of 1 or 2, occasionally 3, were almost invariably useless against the high stats of the large huge figures I faced that day. But in truth, the Arogrettes did influence the games in a profound way with their bonding. It is remarkable to me just how much that flexibility between Mimring and Krug carried me that day. Even though I believe I misdrafted my army with Charos, Krug and Mimring still led me to some nice wins. That combo of heroes, united in their link to the Arogrettes, never ceases to impress me. Final score: 3 wins, 2 losses. July 29th, 2023. The next tournament I went to was on July 29th, 2023, and in the time since I joined the SoCal Heroscapers group, this was the biggest yet in terms of turnout. 14 people were in attendance, myself included, and for the first time, I got 2 of my friends that I played Heroscape with growing up to come with me. My friend Sammy, who'd grown fond of the Mohican River tribe as a unit, vowed to bring them to his first tournament, and my friend Alex, adorer of Nigoxa and all things Maro since we were in elementary school, vowed to bring him and an all-Maro army to his first tournament. Rules and format. For the first time since I joined the SoCal Heroscapers, we were going to a tournament using Delta points. This was a format I knew about, but largely overlooked in games with my local group of friends. For those unfamiliar, Delta is a community rebalancing project that assigns new points prices to units across Heroscape to better match that unit's power ranking. So, traditionally competitive units like Major Q9 and Nilfheim go up in price in Delta, while traditionally less competitive units like Wosaga or Seilin the Kairi Warrior go down in points. This format makes a lot of traditionally non-meta builds more viable, and stronger builds harder or impossible to field in certain army configurations. In addition to Delta points, VC units would be allowed again as well, and the Marvel unit ban remained in place. But the VC Delta format combo significantly opened up the number of builds one might expect to see. It also removed the need to place limits on certain figures, like no more than 9 of a common figure, or no more than 1 of an A+ ranked unit in classic points. We were also allowed 21 hex start zone spaces, and that combined with the VC Delta format made the army drafting experience, in my opinion, much more fun. My army. In building my army for this event, I wanted to take full advantage of the VC Delta format, while also not breaking the bank in ordering the figures needed to run it. Coincidentally, one of the most recent VC unit releases I was interested in from a mechanical standpoint was also one of the cheapest to get my hands on. These were the Amberhive Protectors, a common squad of 4 giant bees that follow General Aquila. While the Amberhive require large numbers of units to truly take advantage of their powers, the figures chosen to represent them were dirt cheap at the time. I recall paying well below $30 for 24 of those bee figures, giving me enough bees for 6 squads of Amberhive. I ordered some small faux Heroscape bases to put them on, spent an evening supergluing them to those bases, and soon had 6 squads of playable Amberhive Protectors at my disposal. I was intrigued by the Amberhive because of their potential from the combination of their insect strategic bonding power and their sacrificial sting special attack. Insect strategic bonding was a new flavor of the dwarven strategic bonding power seen on the axe grinders of Burning Forge from classic Heroscape, in that a player can choose not to bond with an eligible hero to gain a bonus when activating the bonding squad. For the axe grinders, opting out of bonding with a dwarf hero allows the 4 activated axe grinders to add 2 to their move. But with the bees, opting out of bonding with an insect hero allows a player to activate 6 bees instead of the usual 4, a huge number of activations per turn. But it was insect strategic bonding combined with their sacrificial sting special attack that really caught my eye. Any activated bees on a turn could choose to attack with their special so long as they were within 4 spaces of an insect hero their player controlled, and this special attack raises their attack from 1 to 4. So in theory, the bees could be putting out 6 attacks of 4 in one turn. That's 24 dice a player could throw at their opponent, though I don't recommend that. Instead, just roll the dice on the table, you spaz. In any case, this was an impressive offensive output potential for the bees. The big caveat is that when a bee does at least 1 wound with the special, the bee has to die. Still, if they could kill the opponent's forces quickly, as I thought they could, their deaths would be acceptable. But I needed an insect hero to pull that off, and there were at the time of this tournament 2 insect heroes to choose from in both Classic and VC Heroscape. Classic Heroscape gave us Sujoa, a giant wasp-like creature, and for my money, one of Classic Heroscape's most beautiful figures. And VC gave us Mellifera, the giant queen bee of the Amberhive protectors, who grants a potential attack frenzy bonus for Amberhive near her. One could build this army like a king or queen army, with a single insect hero to be protected at all costs. But with Delta points, I didn't need to choose. Mellifera was still new and hadn't changed in her original price of 100 points at the time of the tournament, but Sujoa was discounted by 35 points in Delta, a price I was happy to pay. Together, they were an affordable 235 points. In addition to getting Sujoa's damage potential with her Poison Sting special, I thought having 2 insect heroes to bond with would give me flexibility in responding to threats, as well as insurance. If one went down early, I had another nearby to help set up for Sacrificial Sting. Plus, having 2 insect heroes meant I could increase the number of hexes on the board where Sacrificial Sting could be set up. I believed that if the bees were going to work, they needed to be hitting the opponent with as many sacrifice attacks as possible. If they couldn't, such as if both of my insect heroes went down too early, then the Amberhive stood little chance of winning. To ensure that didn't happen, I needed to play them as they were intended, in a furious swarm. And so, I drafted 4 squads of Amberhive, amounting to 16 bees, plus Sujoa and Mellifera. It was an extremely mobile army, undeterred by terrain due to flying, that also boasted tremendous order marker flexibility, in that all of my order markers could be thrown onto the Amberhive, and I could adapt to the situation as needed, bonding either with Mellifera or Sujoa, or simply activating 6 bees in one turn without bonding. But there was a potential problem. While 4 attack is respectable, theoretically, the highest attack my army was capable of without glyphs was an attack of 5, and only if Sujoa was attacking down on height. And if attacking a hero with some lives left on them, I was probably going to use Sujoa's Poison Sting special, which is capped at 4 attack. It wasn't a bad attack threshold, but I could imagine having a tough time getting through a high defense figure like a Q9 with attacks that low. Still, I thought such bad matchups were few and unlikely in VC Delta. If such a danger figure did appear, I decided that Sujoa would be my answer, a lightning-fast, rapid-response assassin who could intercept a dangerous figure and, if lucky on his Poison Sting, inflict significant damage on them. With those figures drafted, I had 15 points left to spend on a filler unit. VC Delta provided a few options: Otonashi and the Demutive Guard from Classic Heroscape, the Sahuagin Raider from official D&D Heroscape, the Command Courier from VC, and Ball, a goblin hero from VC who followed Aquila. There were arguments for all but the Command Courier. But since my army was all Aquila so far, Ball seemed like a fun and thematic pick. He had some neat abilities like Opportunistic Hero that made him stand out mechanically too. Best of all, his figure only cost around $3 to order. And with that, I had my army. I ran a few practice games against my friend Sammy, who for his build decided on 3 squads of Mohican River Tribe, Venok Warlord, Major J-15, and Krug. In an extremely close practice game, Sammy narrowly beat me. While a loss, the Bee's performance nevertheless impressed me, and I committed myself to the swarm. Performance notes and armies faced. When the day of the tournament came, my friends and I loaded our gear, maps, and figures into my car and headed out to the venue. My friend Alex wasn't sure what to run, only that he wanted to run Morrow. With the VC Delta format, I recommended he give the Grok Riders a go, since they were discounted a whopping 60 points. We had 2 squads of them, and that plus Miburksa, Nigoxa, and Subakna amounted to a synergistic all-Morrow army at 440 points. Alex was sold, though I was worried I might have set him up with something that wouldn't perform well. Either way, we hit the road, prepared for a full day of Scape. On the way there, we discussed our armies, and Sammy and Alex jokingly said, don't stress so much on how to play the bees. We all know that it is Baal who will bring you victory, for he is the mightiest figure in your army. Game 1. For my first game, I faced an army not unlike what I had drafted for Alex, an army composed of Grok Riders, Subakna, and Nigaxa. Instead of Miberxa, I remember this army having some Nagrubs for Subakna to bond with and munch. I don't remember my opponent's exact build or all of the details of the game, but I roughly remember how my bees played. They were able to advance much faster than my opponent's figures could. I also hid many of them behind ruins, which most of my opponent's figures couldn't fly over. When my opponent's figures got within range, I'd fly my bees up and over the ruins and rush them in for sacrifices. I recall the bees doing most of the work that game, with Mellifera and Sujoa standing back as support. I took the win, and got a boost of confidence in the bees to start off the day. Game 2. The army I was up against for my second game quickly put that confidence in check. My opponent brought an army teeming with figures, a mixed arrow and blade grut army. To the best of my memory, this army contained 2 arrow gruts, 2 blade gruts, 2 swag riders, Tornak, and Krug. I believe it had to leave behind a figure to fit within the 21 hex start zone, and may have been 10 points below 440, but don't quote me on those points. In any case, it was a lot of figures I'd need to kill to win, and this army checked mine in some significant ways. For one, it had cheap ranged figures in the arrow gruts. While normally they're not too significant a threat, their unbuffed attacks of 1 actually stood a fair chance of killing my bees from afar. If my bees must die, I want them to die in sacrifice attacks, not from paltry attacks from low cost range, and the arrows are as low cost as common range gets. Our 2 armies' mobility was a concern as well. There aren't many armies that can surpass or match the mobility and early development potential of the bees, but grut armies are close. Both arrow and blade gruts have 6 move, with fast bonding options in Tornak and Swag Riders. Plus, the map we played on contained a lot of road, which would make them even faster. Whatever advantages I could extract from my bees' mobility was reduced on this map with my opponent's own high speed and road bonus potential. And then there was the Krug issue. I had experience playing bees against Krug when practicing with Sammy. Dealing with Krug in isolation wasn't too difficult. I could just sacrifice a ton of bees on him and he would fall quickly with his average defense of 3. But my bees die when they sacrifice, and if I destroyed a mass of bees to kill Krug, I'd still have an entire grut horde to deal with. And I doubted I'd have the numbers on my side to contend with that scenario. In this matchup, it seemed best instead to use my bees to take out the lower gruts on the board to match their numbers. And against unbuffed arrow and blade gruts, the bees had a reasonable chance to kill just using their weak normal attacks, thereby not sacrificing themselves. I decided that to deal with Krug, I would have to, begrudgingly, send in Sujoa. His poison sting attack had a good chance of doing the initial wound needed to start rolling for poison damage. With luck, I could get good damage on Krug through poison wounds. But then, there's the double attack wounded smash combo. If Sujoa couldn't finish the job on Krug, he'd likely power Krug up with wounds and, on the next turn, the giant troll would drop the smackdown on him. It would come down to timing and dice rolls. Maybe, I thought, I could soften Krug up with a few bee sacrifices and send in Sujoa to finish him off. But either way, this fight was going to be a doozy. Both our armies developed lots of figures far into the map. I recall my opponent focusing on developing specific pods of blades and arrows one at a time in waves, rather than slow roll the entire army. The arrows, supported by Swag Riders, did exactly what I feared and shot down lots of bees from afar. I had some luck in that there were lots of convenient ruins I could easily hide my bees in, but the arrow fire forced me to cluster my bees together in those safe spots, rather than spread out across the map as I wished I could have. Still, I was able to take out lots of gruts with bees jumping out of cover for ambushes. I think I even took out a swag with a bee's normal attack. But then came Krug, marching down the middle of the map on road, running straight for my heroes and whacking some bees along the way. As he approached, I rocketed in Sujoa and went for the sting. I remember doing initial attack damage and failing the rolls for extra poison damage. That charged Krug up slightly for the next turn, in which he did some serious damage on Sujoa. I remember trying to poison Krug a second time and failing. On Krug's next turn, he brought Sujoa down. Things weren't looking good for my army, but I still had Mellifera and a decent contingent of bees left over. If I played carefully, I might be able to turn the tide. That was until a new variable in the fight emerged. To keep the day moving, games were restricted to 40 to 45 minutes in length. If a game wasn't fully resolved by the end, the player with the most points left on the board would be declared the winner. I realized then how time-consuming my army was to play on account of the large number of figures I was moving, and my opponent's army was similarly time-consuming. There was no way we'd resolve the game in the time limit, and my opponent had a healthy lead on me in points. I tried to do some more damage to even out our scores, but it was too late. The game was called, and my opponent had protected more of his points on the board, taking the win. I realized that not only would I have to play carefully with my army, but also play quickly, two imperatives that don't necessarily go together. Game 3. My third game that day was something of a rematch. I was facing the same opponent who steamrolled me in the championship match of the first tournament I attended, using an army very similar to the one he brought that time. Yes, the shimmering golden dragon Caligrith had returned, supported by her usual retinue of 3 squads of greenscale warriors. This time, however, the army had the elite Onyx Vipers as the filler, interestingly, without the support of the Venok Warlord. While I normally would never draft Venok Vipers without the Warlord, as a unique squad, the elite Onyx are much more independent from him, and were nicely discounted 30 points in Delta, so it struck me as a clever filler unit. I knew my opponent was a skilled player, and I had developed respect and not a small amount of fear for the Caligrith Greenscales combo. Could I get revenge against my golden nemesis? I played a similar opening game to how I'd done the previous 2 games, in that I used a few turns to activate 6 bees to expand my area of influence, then moved in my heroes to set up for sacrifices. My bees were great for initial glyph grabbing too, and could occupy and surround a glyph to keep it out of enemy hands. But Caligrith was approaching, and once she got into the fight, her Burning Breath special roasted swaths of my bees. The good news was my bees generally killed any greenscales they engaged with sacrifices, which was a great points trade for how much each of those figures cost. Despite this, my opponent got Caligrith set up on a rock perch and surrounded her with greenscales, no doubt setting up for another fire bombing run. With Caligrith's high move, she could fly over her perch, burn a few figures, then fly right back onto it, a cycle of destruction I wanted to prevent. But I knew I couldn't just wait for my opponent to slip up in his positioning. A few more good Caligrith runs, and I'd lose most of my army. So I made the unpleasant decision to rush as many bees as I could into Caligrith's perch, and sacrifice them all for as much damage as possible. And it paid off. They made short work of the greenscales and did significant damage on Caligrith, even while she was on height. But in doing so, they had all perished. I was down to just Sujoa against a severely wounded Caligrith and the elite Onyx Vipers. Caligrith got the jump on Sujoa and put a few wounds on him with her strong 6 attack, but Sujoa poison-stung Caligrith to death. It was now an injured Sujoa against the Vipers. I forget if the Vipers frenzied or not, but Sujoa tanked the rest of the game and took them out. The Golden Dragon was beaten, and I'm glad and grateful that my opponent played hard and made me work for it. Game 4. It seemed a matter of destiny that at some point that day, Sammy and I, with the armies we had practiced on each other the night before, would face off in a proper tournament game. And so we did on the 4th match that day. Of all my friends I grew up playing Heroscape with, Sammy was the friend I'd played the most against. We were acutely attuned to each other's playstyles, and from our practice match, we felt that our armies were close matches for each other. To recap, Sammy brought 3 squads of Mohicans, Major J-15, Venok Warlord, and Krug, and it was a rough army for my bees to fight. With their Venok buffed 7 move and 6 range, the Mohicans could quickly develop onto height and start shooting at me before I could engage them. It was nearly impossible to protect all of my bees in the early game, and some were inevitably going to die before our armies clashed. What I had to hope for was that enough of my attacking bees could survive the initial Mohican salvo to start sacrificing and swing the momentum of battle in my favor through sheer numbers. J-15 had a higher defense than most figures I'd faced that day, with a powerful ranged attack and a bonus against large and huge figures. Sammy had used J-15 effectively against my insect heroes in our practice game, and I knew I had to keep him at bay with some of my bees. And of course, there was Krug, who'd bested my Sujoa earlier that day and would pose a similar dilemma in how to deal with him this game. The main advantage my army had over Sammy's was order marker flexibility. as he would have to spend order markers on each of his units separately to use them. With his unit's excellent stats though, I had to hope I could exploit his order marker timing to get the jump on his powerful heroes. The game progressed much as it had the night before, with my side losing many bees to Mohican gunfire early on. However, once my swarm engaged, my bees sacrificed themselves to take down the Braves and level out the field. But J-15 was moving in. I recall J-15 doing massive damage to Sujoa before my forces took the major down. The Mohicans had been severely thinned out, but that hardly mattered. Sammy still had a full-life Krug in his start zone, who could easily rip me to shreds. By that point in the game, Sujoa was down to 1 life. On my next turn, I decided to rush Sujoa in for a last-ditch Hail Mary attack on Krug. I threw a poison sting attack at Krug, and successfully got a wound to start the rolls for poison damage. I rolled, and got another wound. Then I rolled, and got another. And another. And another. And another. Until Krug dropped dead. A gravely wounded Sujoa, clinging to 1 life, stung an unwounded Krug to death in a single attack. It was a massive reversal of fortunes that kept me in the game. But Sammy still had a few Mohicans left, and I was down to Mellifera. Mellifera picked off all but 1 Mohican, taking serious damage in the process. Sammy made a gamble that put his last Mohican on a lava field height space to shoot down Mellifera. With that attack, he got the Queen Bee down to 1 life. I didn't want to attack Sammy on height, and so I took the same risk and flew Mellifera onto a lava space, even level with the Mohican. I tried to kill him, but failed. Then, at the end of the round, we both had to roll for lava damage. The outcome of the game rested on who could survive this lava damage roll. Incredibly, we both rolled a skull, and both of our last units died at exactly the same time. It was a draw. My first tournament draw, and probably only my second draw in a Heroscape game in my life. And to this day, Sammy and I tell each other that it was fate our first competitive Heroscape game against each other would be a draw. Were that even a match? Game 5. I may be misremembering, but I believe the 4th game that day was the start of the playoffs for the championship, and my first playoff match was against an army that included several squads of Maro Stingers, the Krav Maga agents, and Isamu. I don't remember my opponent's full army, but its core was Stingers. This match would take place on Ember Canyon Road, a detail to remember going forward. I'll put an image on screen of what Ember Canyon Road looks like for reference. I realized quickly that the bees had a significant advantage on this map against many possible armies. With flight, my bees could effortlessly scale the steep terrain on my side of the map, and with their small height, I was able to position several bees on the second highest level of lava terrain just underneath the highest level, which kept them hidden from ranged fire. As my opponent slowly scaled his side of the map on foot, when the time was right, I rushed my bees in to jump his figures on height. With my sacrifices, I made quick work of several stingers that were trying to climb their hill. Occasionally, though, I'd leave a bee alive and take a shot with a normal attack on height. I'd do this if I wanted to tie down a bunch of figures, and on height, my bee had a decent chance of surviving and doing damage with a normal attack. Another aspect of this map in my favor was the glyph position. A power glyph resided in the valley corridor between our 2 hills, and I recall flying in Mellifera to take the glyph, where she was well hidden from the stingers who were still struggling to climb their hill. This had the added bonus of making all of my frontline bees on my opponent's hill eligible for her Frenzied Swarm power, which allows them to attack multiple times on d20 rolls of 14 or higher. The range of her Frenzy aura is 4 spaces, but importantly, not 4 clear sight spaces. With Mellifera in the pit between our 2 hills, she never would have been able to see her bees, and so, putting her there kept her out of sight of my enemy, but within range of my bees to activate Frenzy. I think the idea is that Mellifera communicates her orders to her drones, not through sight, but through scent and pheromones. A cool and thematic mechanic. And I recall it paying off for a time, getting lots of kills. But at some point, my opponent swung the momentum in his favor. My bees were failing to kill the stingers, or to frenzy, and the stingers' high attacks were cutting through my bees at the same time. I recall rushing in Mellifera to reinforce and take out some stingers. My opponent still had his Krav Maga and Isamu back at his start zone, and to prepare for them, I began moving up Sujoa, whom I'd kept on my hill waiting for the right time to rush in. Mellifera and the rest of the bees fell at roughly the same time that my opponent's stinger force fell, and so he would naturally start moving his Krav Maga after. The Krav in endgame can be brutal, especially when they're spread out across the map and are shooting at you from multiple angles. But at that point in the game, the Krav were still clustered adjacent to each other in the start zone. To avoid them developing into a better position, I dashed Sujoa in to engage all three in melee. It was dice rolling at that point, but they more or less killed each other in short order. Now the game had come down to Isamu versus my Bowl. Knowing Isamu's tricks, I wasn't feeling too good about my odds. But I played it out, and Ball and Isamu engaged. Ball rolled a skull on an attack, and incredibly, Isamu's vanish power failed. Isamu then failed to defend against Ball's attack, and the little goblin hero took the win. It was an intense, incredibly close game that I probably shouldn't have won on odds alone. Never did I think a match would come down to just Ball versus my opponent's last unit, but I wasn't complaining. Game 6. The 6th game that day, and from my memory, the second of the playoffs, saw another rematch. I would once again face Sammy's Mohicans. We'd had a draw earlier that day, and I think our armies were itching for a rematch to settle the score. My army in particular had never beaten Sammy's army before, only tied against it. In a stroke of fortune, we were assigned yet again to Ember Canyon Road, but the matchup was a lot smoother this time. While my bees still had superior mobility on a map that favored them, Sammy's Mohicans were much faster than Stingers when being buffed by the Vanok Warlord. They were able to scale their hill much more quickly than the Stingers in the previous game, and I remember I couldn't secure height on them as frequently. I don't remember the details of this match very well. I recall doing the same Mellifera trick where I put her in the center to set up frenzies, which paid off a few times. And I remembered the Mohicans and Vanok Warlord were taken out first from bee attacks. If I recall correctly, I repeated what I did last time, and sent Sujoa in to try and sting Krug and hope for the best. Sujoa did sting and did a ton of damage, but just not enough to kill. And for Krug, that's exactly where he wants to be. An angry, charged up Krug smashed Sujoa into a pulp, killing the giant bug instantly. It was down to the wire once again, with Sammy's severely injured Krug against none other than Bowl. The situation was clear. Whoever could engage the opponent first was likely to win the game, but Sammy considerably more so. A single attack from the raged up Krug would obliterate Bowl, let alone his first two from double attack. But Bowl possessed his ankle shank power, granting him a modest attack bonus against large and huge figures. With that attack bonus, Ball actually stood a decent chance of doing the last wound needed to end Krug. It all came down to timing. Who would engage first? We both played our figures very carefully, strafing around the board waiting for our opportunity. Ball had one extra move than Krug, and so could keep just out of his threat range. I remember letting the round run out and gambling on an initiative switch, which I miraculously got. This was my one shot. If Ball couldn't pull this off, I'd surely lose. I sent Ball in and hit Krug with an ankle shank, and incredibly, it did exactly enough damage to kill him. Sammy and I realized then that our armies were perfectly matched. He beat me the night before, I beat him then, plus a draw earlier that day. But more than that, Ball had won me another game by the skin of my teeth and advanced me to the semi-finals. The facetious comments my friends made on the drive to the tournament about Ball being the key to victory suddenly didn't seem so ironic after all. Game 7. My last game of the semi-finals had arrived. Amazingly, I was randomly assigned yet again to play on Ember Canyon Road. This time I was up against another strong army for the format. I don't remember its complete composition, but it had a core of several squads of Microcorp agents, plus at least one Fen Hydra and Salen the Kyrie Warrior. At a discounted 50 points in VC Delta, Salen struck me as a bargain filler unit that could help ferry important figures out across the board. And on this map, her Staff of Summoning would help my opponent's army traverse his hill, especially the somewhat slow-moving and highly dangerous Hydra. If I could win this match, I would advance to the championship game. This was another game I don't remember many details of, but I believe I played my team similarly to how I had played on my previous two games on this map. My opponent made clever use of Salen by moving her onto the hill to attempt to summon, with Microcorp agents climbing the hill after her. As he was setting up his position, I was preparing a swarm of bees to fly over the map to his hill and hit his position hard. If I recall correctly, I did the Mellifera trick again on this map, putting her safely in the center and slamming my opponent with bees on his hill. Things got a bit dicey when the Hydra successfully summoned in, presenting my army with a figure that could easily kill a squad of bees in one turn. But with my bees' numbers and the height they'd quickly obtained, I had built up a momentum that sustained me to the end. I took the win and advanced to the championship. Game 8. And so came the championship. This was the second championship match I'd reached so far that year, coming in second place in my first tournament. And this time, a lot more was at stake. With a higher number of players in this tournament than my first, more prize money was up for grabs, plus the first pick of 2 VC heroes available in the prize pool. But more than all that, I was excited at the prospect that I had another shot at actually coming in first place in a Heroscape tournament. But the road to victory would be a grueling one. I was set up against the one army that had beaten me that day, the Arrow and Blade Grut Horde, supported by Tornak, Swag Riders, and Krug. It was little surprise this one had made it to the championship, as it had bonding flexibility, a huge number of figures and activation potential, buffing support characters, and high offensive potential in Krug. I played a terrible game on my first championship at the start of the year, allowing myself to get baited into a trap and thereby steamrolled for the rest of the game. I had to play harder and smarter this time if I wanted to take the win. The map we were set to play on was Arborshate's Pathway. Unlike the first map I faced this Grut army on, Arborshate's Pathway was a bit more concise and difficult to traverse, which my bees could exploit with their flying. There was also a central bridge that used both bridge wall pieces on either side. This would allow my bees to perfectly hide on the bridge and set up for attacks into my opponent's side of the board. But my opponent had high mobility too across his entire army, and we had roughly the same number of figures in our armies that we'd each need to chew through to win. It was decided that the championship game would be allowed to play itself out without a time limit, which was what did me in the first time I faced this army. But even with that limitation removed, this was going to be a slog. Both of our armies developed steadily onto the map. My opponent sent in a Swag Rider early to take a glyph, which unfortunately for him, fortunately for me, turned out to be a pit trap. As my bees and his orcs finally met, I got several opportunities to jump his buffing heroes with bee sacrifices. I got an early kill on Tornak and quickly took out both Swag Riders as well. I also positioned Mellifera on the central bridge, where she could make a large area of the map eligible for my bees to frenzy, and Sujoa was set up nearby for any assassination runs I might need him to do. But both of our armies still had most of our infantry, particularly my opponent, who still had huge reserves of arrow and blade gruts to pull from. It was then that Krug began moving up, and that one troll could pulverize my entire army. I didn't want to do incremental damage against him with bee attacks, because that could charge him up, and I'd be sacrificing my foot soldiers I'd need to take on the other gruts across the map. As the unwounded Krug neared the center of the map, I called in Sujoa. The giant bug had been a Krug killer throughout the day, and I needed him to do it again. Sujoa could theoretically kill Krug in one turn without giving him any chance to double attack, as Sujoa did in my first game against Sammy. But if Sujoa couldn't do enough damage to kill Krug, I'd have a nightmare on my hands. The two giants engaged on even level. Sujoa attempted a sting, and failed. Krug remained unwounded, and so wasn't a serious threat to Sujoa yet. After bonding with Sujoa, I sent my bees out to mop up some gruts around the map, rather than risk charging up Krug with sacrifice wounds. Next turn, my opponent activated Krug and got a single wound on Sujoa. Then, my turn. I needed Sujoa to sting. He tried again, and failed again. No wounds on Krug. Things were looking very, very bad. I needed some kind of breakthrough on Krug to keep pace with the progress my opponent was making on me. So I sent in some bees to sacrifice and get some wounds on the troll. They did significant damage on him, but didn't kill. This meant Krug was supercharged, and would likely destroy Sujoa on his next turn. But miraculously, my opponent's next order marker was on the Blade Gruts, and so he couldn't activate Krug. Sujoa might survive yet. The blades did bits of damage here and there, but nothing on the big bug. And then the round ended. My hopes for victory hinged on this initiative roll. If I lost, Krug would surely be activated, and would surely destroy Sujoa next turn. We both rolled for initiative, and I won. This was the break I needed. If Sujoa couldn't kill Krug this turn, I was doomed. Sujoa attempted his sting, and got an initial wound to begin the sting damage. I needed one d20 roll of sting damage to kill Krug, and incredibly, I got it. The mighty Krug had fallen once again to Sujoa, but the game was far from over. My opponent had only Grut infantry left over, but they far outnumbered my forces, as most of my bees had sacrificed themselves. And with their numbers, the Blade Gruts surrounded Sujoa and began whacking him for bite-sized damage. Sujoa tanked for a bit, taking out a Grut here and there, but there were simply too many orcs, and Sujoa would soon be overwhelmed. I sent in Mellifera to relieve some of the pressure, half expecting Sujoa to die early. Eventually, Sujoa succumbed to the attrition and was killed. The mob of Gruts then turned to Mellifera, with one getting the jump on her from height. She lived long enough to kill 2 or 3 more orcs before she too fell. From what seemed like a reversal of fortunes with the Krug kill, the game once again appeared to turn against me. My opponent had 2 Blade Gruts and an Arrow Grut remaining, and all I had was Ball. I had certainly been impressed with some of Ball's feats that day. He killed Isamu and Krug, both games that propelled me to this championship. But he would need to pull off a miracle to survive this. Nervous as I was, I refused to give up. While my opponent had the numbers, his forces were spread out across the map and controlled by 2 different army cards. The most number of attacks he could get on Ball in one turn was 2, and only after a few turns to rally his 2 Blade Gruts to the same area of the map. I had to prevent that from happening at all costs. Ball rushed forward to the closest Blade Grut, and the 2 engaged. Both slashed at each other for a few turns to no avail, but then Ball got the kill. Now a single Blade Grut and a single Arrow Grut remained, and both were on the other side of the central bridge. My opponent moved in his last Blade Grut, and he and Ball engaged on the bridge. A dramatic duel ensued, made unintentionally more dramatic due to a quirk in the map design where one side of the bridge was somewhat unstable. Those watching the game imagined the 2 warriors were fighting on a bridge that was slowly collapsing. Someone even put on Duel of the Fates from Star Wars. The air was electric. Ball and the Blade Grut fought hard. I remember one moment where the Blade Grut dropped a 2-skull attack on Ball, which incredibly, Ball defended against. The duel went on for a long time, each dice roll excruciating to watch. And then, Ball did it. He broke through and killed the Blade Grut. This 10-point goblin hero had won 2 games so far that day, both times against the odds, and now Ball was in the championship, facing down the last Arrow Grut, 1v1. My opponent used his range and mobility well. He kept the Arrow Grut on height and took a 2-shot attack on Ball. It missed. Now came the big decision on my turn. The Arrow Grut was within striking distance of Ball, but he was on height and nestled between line-of-sight obstacles. In other words, there was no way Ball could get to even level against the Arrow Grut that turn. If I didn't attack this turn, the arrow would slip away and continue harassing me from afar, and with his disengage, there was no way I could lock him down. Thinking of the odds, it was my 2 attack versus the arrow's 2 defense on height. With Heroscape combat dice probabilities, the odds were in my favor. I just needed 1 wound. I bit the bullet and sent Ball in to engage. This was it. Ball rolled a single skull. My opponent rolled and blanked. Ball had done it. For the 3rd time that day, Ball had done it. Ball had beaten the odds once again and officially won me my first Heroscape tournament. My opponent and I shook hands and thanked the other for the incredible game. I vividly remember the details of that game because of how intense it was. One moment my opponent looked strong, the next I looked strong, and the next my opponent again. The tables turned constantly, and it came right down to the wire. It was, quite simply, the greatest and most exhilarating game of Heroscape I have ever played, and I'm grateful to my opponent for giving me the fight of my Heroscape life. I took home most of the prize money, as well as the VC unit Jarek Guy. My opponent also took home some money and another VC unit. It was an incredible end to a long and exciting day of Heroscape. When I got home, I put my Ball figure in a little display case. That specific Ball figure is now retired in my collection. You fought well, little guy. Rest eternal. Takeaways and conclusion. It's hard for me to objectively analyze my performance that day because of how thrilling the championship match was and how fondly I look back on it. There was not a small amount of dumb luck that went into my first place win that day, getting an extremely favorable map 3 times in a row during the playoffs. One obvious takeaway was the reminder that, in Heroscape, it's not over till it's over. If you have the time to play out a game, play it out. You never know what miracles you might be graced with. it was also a reminder to never underestimate any figure in the game. My friends and I had joked about Ball on our drive to the tournament. "Oh, just you wait, he'll be what brings you victory," we said facetiously. Well, he humbled us. But when emotions cooled down, I had time to reflect on the performance of the Amberhive Protectors as both a unit and a build. I had a ton of fun with the bees, and they afford a competitive player a lot of advantages and bonding flexibility. I definitely think Mellifera is an auto-include in their army, as the frenzied swarm power is too important in ensuring the bees pull off their sacrifices. I love the high number of strong attacks possible in a single turn with the bees, plus the detail that a bee only dies if it succeeds in doing damage, so if you fail, you get to keep that bee that attacked. But more than most armies, if not all other armies, the bees are about points trade-off numbers. You cannot win with the bees unless your sacrificing is killing more points than you're losing in sacrificing bees. While that's generally easy to pull off with how cheap each bee is, it's a momentum you need to sustain throughout an entire game. Because if your opponent can reverse that momentum, your bees will die before they can start trading points through sacrifices. One of the worst things for this army is to have the bees get killed early on by enemy ranged fire, as happened when I faced the Mohicans. If my bees are going to die, I want them to die for a good cause, in killing enemy squad figures or wounding enemy heroes. And if your opponent gets a turn in which they can activate a bunch of squaddies that rip through a squad of bees, I think that bodes poorly for your odds. The bees are somewhat comparable to the Venok Vipers in that you want them to be striking first and hitting as hard as they can before the opponent gets a turn on them, because on that opponent's turn, you're likely to lose lots of your figures. That said, the bees at least have 2 base defense, which occasionally shrugs off weak attacks. And it's sometimes useful not to sacrifice with a bee so that it holds onto a space it's occupying to lock down some figures and control a portion of the board into the opponent's turn. That leads into another challenge to fielding the bees. Whenever your bees die in sacrifice attacks, so does your board development they had achieved with the ones that moved up. You can position your bees as carefully across the board as you like, but when they sacrifice, you're giving up all that board control you had. This is mitigated somewhat by their high number and high mobility, and if you're careful with placement, redeveloping the board after a bunch of sacrifices shouldn't take too long. But I think it requires a player to think differently about how they develop and move their figures, as you're commanding a horde of suicide attackers who you will often want to die to inflict their massive damage. So anticipating a constant reversal of your board development, I think, has to be a part of your game plan going into a match leading the bees. I think there's a lot to analyze in the mechanics of the Amberhive Protectors, both as units and as a build with Mellifera and whatever else you support them with. It gave me the idea of making a side series on this channel in which I do deep dives into specific builds I enjoy playing in Heroscape, studying their playstyles, strengths, and weaknesses. If that sounds like a series of interest, let me know in the comments. Overall though, it was an incredible tournament that will have a special place in my heart as my first big win. But I had a lot more to learn about the game in the tournaments that followed that year. Final score: 6 wins, 1 loss, 1 draw. September 2nd, 2023. Our next event was held on September 2nd, 2023, at the same game store I played the bees in. The number of attendees this time was much smaller than last time, 8 in total including myself. My 2 friends who came last time both couldn't make it to this tournament. They said they had family, work, and other, quote, more important life obligations that they had to attend to, which has to be the most pathetic excuse not to play Heroscape I've ever heard. Still, my friend Sammy, from the last event, offered to help me practice any army I ran with against potential matchups for this event. Rules and format. As for the rules of this event, we would once again be going VC Delta, but this time banning all units with any form of range. This included both ranged normal and special attacks, plus any ranged powers like Braxis's Poison Acid Breath. As an example, I at one point wanted to run the VC hero Exensia, who has a base range of 1, but I realized her Immolation power has the potential for a one-time explosion power that has a range of 2. I ran it by the organizer, and it was decided that that counted as range, which was a commitment to the no range rule that I admired. So I had to consider another build. Our point limit was 400 with 24 hex start zones, so in terms of points, I had a bit less to work with than last tournament. My army. I began devising my army by considering what armies I could now viably run that wouldn't have been as easy to run if I knew there was a chance I'd have to face range. One that sprang to mind almost immediately was the Firestorm, that being an army built around Kurok the Elementalist with several fire elementals at his command. Range is the biggest Achilles heel to this build, as ranged figures can snipe Kurok and decapitate the entire army early. In all melee, however, any opponent would have to get through a literal firewall before they could damage Kurok. At the 400 point limit in VC Delta, I could afford Kurok and exactly 8 fire elementals, nothing more. I'd read that when running Firestorm, around 10 fire elementals is ideal, and so I was somewhat worried only 8 wasn't enough to make the army work. But I figured with the reduced point limit of 400, opposing armies would be lowered in overall potential to match the suboptimal fire elemental count. The other big factor in choosing my tournament armies in general is, frankly, real-world cost. I enjoy running different armies tournament to tournament, but that can get pricey if you're trying to bring different, competitively viable armies to multiple events a year. That is, if you go with official figures. But a public library near my work does high-volume 3D prints for dirt cheap, and could even print in monochrome orange, which would be perfect for fire elementals. They quoted me around $9 for an order of 8 orange fire elemental prints, with bases, and that incentivized me even more to pick this army. With Firestorm a serious contender, I then considered how well it would fare against potential matchups in an all-melee format. I anticipated Warriors of Ashra, non-ranged Samurai, Venok Vipers, and non-ranged Kairi squads, particularly the Enar Imperium, who were significantly discounted in VC Delta. I thought Firestorm was great into most of those potential builds. With the Fire Elemental's searing intensity, I could bypass the Ashura's defensive agility, the Samurai's counterstrike, as well as other favorable powers like Disappearing Ninja or Isamu's Vanish 9. But I was very concerned about facing the Imperium and the Venoks. With the Imperium, their stealth flying meant I couldn't pin them down with Fire Elemental engagements, and they could fly straight for Kurok and hit him with multiple double attacks. And then there were the Venoks. A Venok build would have vast superiority over me in numbers and mobility, meaning I'd probably have to just set up camp and hold the line as best I could. That is a playstyle that suits Kurok well, but with their frenzy power, sooner or later the Vipers would get through and go straight for my Sorcerer. Frankly, I didn't see any way that Firestorm could overcome that. But I also figured that I could afford one bad matchup that day and still have a good shot at the playoffs, if I won most other games. Conceding I didn't stand much chance against the Vipers, my main other concern was facing the Einar Imperium. This was when Sammy jumped in to help grill my army and give me some practice games running the Firestorm. It was during these practice games that I realized my initial approach to playing the army was wrong. My first instinct was to spend my first activation of a game on moving Kurok forward so that he could advance the range of his Master of the Elements power. But this meant giving up early development of my fire elementals, and I was losing many of my early practice games with that strategy. It was then that Sammy gave me the idea that I should slow roll with my elementals first, setting up a firewall ahead of Kurok for the enemy to walk into. Only after I'd lost a few fire elementals should I move up Kurok, as any turn I activate Kurok on, I could also attempt to revive elementals, providing max utility for a turn. If I moved Kurok at the start of the game, there'd be nothing for him to revive, and so wasn't the best use of my order marker in that way. The logic was sound, and I applied the strategy to more practice games. Sure enough, in all melee, I was winning more games with Sammy's strategy. I recall even winning a practice game against Imperium, though barely. It was the Vipers, however, I just couldn't overcome with Firestorm. But with how cheap this army would be to build and bring to a tournament, and how strong it was into most other all-melee builds I could think of, I committed to it. Besides, maybe none of the builds I was worried about would even show. Performance notes and armies faced. Unfortunately, this is another tournament I don't remember most of the details of. I definitely can't recall every army I faced, but I remember my score in bits and pieces from the day, so rather than go game by game per se, I'll do my best to recap how the Firestorm performed against the different units I remember fighting, as well as what I learned from playing it. One army I remember in great detail was an army consisting of 3 squads of Warriors of Ashura, Kazuki Samurai, Tagawa Samurai, and Isamu. In a stroke of luck, we were assigned a map with lava, which I could exploit with my Fire Elemental's lava-resistant power. Their searing intensity was also a hard counter to many powers in my opponent's army, like Defensive Agility, Counterstrike, and Vanish 9. I don't remember many details of the game itself, except that it was a lot closer than I thought it would be, given some of my advantages going into the game. The sheer number of figures my opponent brought forced me to be careful with what parts of the map I developed into, even with the freedom I had to claim height on lava with my elementals. I recall taking the win, but it was close. Another army I remember facing was one that contained several squads of Marten Hounds and Subakna. This was a game that had come after some wins that day, and so I remember going into it feeling fairly confident about the Firestorm build's chances. But that turned out to be overconfidence. The Marten Hounds are a unit that plays similarly to the Fire Elementals in that they have an auto-wound power via Morrow Plague in addition to their normal attack. And with 3 figures per squad, they're the same number of activations per turn as the Fire Elementals with Kurok's power, Master of the Elements. And along with the similarities, Firestorm had no special immunities to facing the Hounds. So both our armies were strong into each other. But looking at the two armies, I had some advantages. Plague had only a 30% chance of triggering with Subakna, compared to Searing Intensity's 35% chance. And while the player running the Marten Hounds rolls only once per turn for Morrow Plague, with Firestorm, you can roll for Searing Intensity 3 times per order marker, if applicable, since a player can take 3 full turns with 3 different elementals. Plus, my army had the potential to regenerate its figures, unlike the Hounds. Altogether, I thought I had an edge, but I played very, very poorly. Anytime you're up against a figure with a power like Searing Intensity or Morrow Plague, you don't want to engage that figure with multiple figures of your own. In doing that, you're just giving your opponent more chances to auto-wound. But that ended up happening for me despite my efforts to only single-engage the Hounds. Because they're double-spaced figures, Marten Hounds can make a very large area of the board eligible for Plague, and can easily multi-engage to set that up. I didn't space my Fire Elementals out well enough, and the Hounds rushed in and engaged a huge chunk of my army. And then my opponent rolled hot for Plague, wiping out lots of Fire Elementals in a single turn. But the fact is, I put myself in a position that allowed my opponent to take advantage of hot rolls. It was a serious lesson learned. I recall pivoting fast to defensive play and retreating Kurok from the Hounds after half my elementals got plagued. I then got my own lucky streak and brought back a lot of Fire Elementals. Somehow, I turned the game around. I remember Subakna engaging Kurok in the endgame, bringing him down to 1 life. Had I lost Kurok, I may well have lost that game. But I recall my remaining Fire Elementals coming through in the end. Still, I was nearly defeated by not appreciating my opponent's army's strengths. The big army I remember facing that day was the one I feared the most, the Venok Vipers. Maybe this was karma for putting them at C tier in my last tier list video. Melee only was exactly the format that they would shine in. My opponent was fielding several squads of Vipers buffed by their warlord. Knowing they'd get to me first, I played defensively, surrounding Kurok with a firewall and waiting for the inevitable. In the beginning, my opponent was making the multi-engage mistake. The Vipers were rushing in and multi-engaging several Fire Elementals at a time. After failing to frenzy, on my own turns, I was able to kill a number of Vipers with my normal attacks and Searing Intensity. For a while, it actually looked as though I might have a shot at overcoming the Viper brood. But my opponent quickly figured out the danger of multi-engaging Fire Elementals and began playing with single engagements in mind. I was still making good progress into his forces, but the Vipers just kept coming. And then the inevitable happened. My opponent got off a frenzy chain. I knew it was only a matter of time before he did, and by that point in the game, my elementals had been thinned out enough that a path to Kurok had been opened. The Vipers rushed in and assassinated Kurok early, leaving my whole army in shambles. From there, my opponent made short work of my elementals. Not that my tier lists mean much in the grand scheme of things, but going into that day, I began sensing that I had seriously underestimated the Vipers' potential when I rated them C tier. And this game showed me how much stronger they are than when I initially reviewed them in my last video. The Vipers can threaten such a huge portion of a map, and can do such incredible damage with frenzies, that I think they're well above C tier in reality. I put a little edit to my ranking for them on the Wave 1 tier list video in the comments, so check that out if you're interested. Either way, that was my first loss of the day, and I had newfound respect for the Vipers as a result. I also remember facing an army that contained the Ninjas of the Northern Wind. What made this fight especially tricky was the map, which had lots of battlement pieces, ruins, and uneven terrain that made traversal difficult and often prevented Kurok from seeing large portions of the field. This limited the potential areas I could develop my Fire Elementals into. My opponent's ninjas, however, were fast, possessed a high 4 attack, and could go wherever they pleased with their effective phantom walk power. I remember eventually settling on a little clearing of the map to make for my Kurok firewall outpost. From there, I sent out my fire elementals in little waves to take out as much as I could. I remember being successful until the ninjas arrived. With their phantom walk, my firewall meant nothing to them, and they rushed straight for Kurok. I was able to kill 1 or 2 using Searing Intensity, which had the ability to bypass their disappearing ninja power, but I remember at least 1 engaging and seriously wounding Kurok. I came very close to losing Kurok and potentially the entire game, but some lucky rolls on Searing Intensity and regenerating fire elementals helped me claim a narrow victory. But those ninjas alone swung the game wildly and nearly handed me defeat. I may have forgotten a game or 2 from that day, but by the end, I had a high enough win score that I made it to the championship. And the other high-scoring team? The same Ashura Samurai Isamu build I faced earlier. The map we were assigned this time didn't have any lava on it, so my opponent would have a lot more movement freedom. But the map was also a somewhat long and narrow map, which I thought would be helpful in preventing my opponent from sending figures to flank my position and skirt around any firewalls I set up to protect Kurok. Additionally, the map was wide open in terms of line of sight blockers, so Kurok had a lot of flexibility in where he could see to activate fire elementals. The fact is, this was a good map for Kurok. I was able to slow roll with my elementals to advance my firewall, and by the time some fighting happened and a few elementals had been destroyed, I was then able to move Kurok up and expand the area of the map he could activate elementals in. Because of the way the map was designed, my opponent and I were regularly counting 8 spaces from Kurok and roughly mapping out in our heads the area of the board Kurok had influence over. Every time Kurok moved forward or backward, it was like he was moving forward or backward the boundaries of an arena he was setting up for his elementals to play in. And both my opponent and I were regularly checking to try and stay out of each other's threat ranges until the time was right. There were some key high spots I was able to set Kurok up on, too high for my opponent to climb in a single turn, but giving the sorcerer a commanding view of the battlefield. One significant threat to the strategy were the Kazuki Samurai with their charging assault power, which gave them a lot of move that could potentially break through to Kurok in one turn if I wasn't careful. I recall holding them off with my firewall, but they did almost get through at one point. In the end, I took the win, largely because the map favored my team. It wasn't a map from any of the major tournament map threads on the forums. Oftentimes, if our events fall short a map or 2 based on the number of players attending, someone will rapidly build a map on the spot with spare parts they brought. While we do our best to make tournament-appropriate maps, they're made in haste without any playtesting, and so can sometimes hugely favor one type of army. This was the case in this match, and it may have gone very differently on another board, but it was nice to take home a second tournament win in a row. Takeaways and conclusion. As one might expect, Firestorm shined in the all-melee format that day. Without any range to worry about, Kurok was nearly untouchable, and arguably more important than the Fire Elemental's excellent base stats was Searing Intensity, which rendered so many important melee-based powers that day useless. The main things that threatened Firestorm were units that could get through the firewall and attack Kurok, such as units with Phantom Walk or high mobility. The former was true of the Ninjas of the Northern Wind, who could potentially kill Kurok in a single turn if all 3 Phantom Walked through the firewall and jumped him with 3 attacks of 4. That single unit could easily ruin the entire army, and it's a minor miracle it didn't happen the game I faced them on. As for high movement attackers, that was the case with the Vipers, which is an army I don't think Firestorm stands much chance at ever beating. The Vipers are too numerous and too fast for Firestorm's small number of figures to overcome, unless you roll hot for Searing Intensity and the opponent never frenzies once. And then, maybe Firestorm could beat it. But it's rough. Additionally, had the Einar Imperium with Kiowa showed up that day, I may not have advanced to the championship. All they'd need is one turn to successfully fly over the firewall and engage Kurok. If they threw 6 attacks of 3 with their double attack power onto Kurok in one order marker, I don't think Kurok would survive. In fact, just 2 Imperium stand a chance of dropping him. While I do think Firestorm's odds against the Imperium is slightly better than against the Vipers, it's still not a good matchup for Kurok, and I was lucky I didn't have to face it. More than all of that, though, was the fact that my friend Sammy's strategy worked. Sometimes all it takes is a friend to help grill your army and give you new ideas on how to play it to make your game many times better. I think if I'd played my original strategy of moving Kurok up first, I wouldn't have made it to the final game, let alone win it. In all melee at least, it made great sense to slow roll a firewall first, then only move up Kurok after you've lost at least one elemental to attempt the revive. So if you're listening to this, Sammy, thanks for helping me strategize for this event. But mark my words, I'll beat your dwarves one day. Final score, 5 wins, 1 loss. Hey everyone, it's Doggin Days, dipping in here with a minor edit. I realize after recording this that I actually, in my notes, don't have anything to support this particular score of 5 wins, 1 loss, because I only remember 4 of the games that I played that day, or I only remember winning 4 of the games that I played that day. So I think it was based on, we had a kind of a website that we were hosting the tournament on, and I believe I saw my score there as 5-1 for win-loss, but I don't have any notes of that, and I don't have access to that website again, where we were keeping track of the scores. So, just in good faith, I'm going to go ahead and just dip it down to 4 wins, 1 loss, because that's at least what I know I scored that day. It might have been 5-1, but I don't have proof of that 5th one, so we're just going to take that out of the ranking, or take that out of the score. So, just wanted to make that little adjustment right there. Okay, on with the video. November 12th, 2023. Our group's penultimate tournament of the year came on November 12th, 2023. This was another event I attended solo from my own friend group, though they would join me again on the next. Coming off of 2 consecutive first place wins, I was eager to continue my streak for a 3rd consecutive win. Rules and format. The rules for this event would once again be VC Delta, but this time unit restrictions were lifted. We were free to draft whatever we wanted within the VC Delta format and under a 500 point limit. I forget the hex limit, but it was somewhere between 21 and 24. My army. With the holidays coming up around that time, I wasn't in the mood to spend a great deal of real-world money on designing a new competitive army I hadn't played before. So I began looking through my existing collection to see what I could field for the format. I forget exactly how, but at some point, my mind returned me to my old favorite, the Torkulna Grubs with Raylin build. I already owned all the figures for that army, and I had success with it in the past, if not a first place win. The army already had sentimental value as my first competitive army, and with 2023 almost at an end, I thought I'd try one more time to see if I could win first place with it before 2024. But things were different this time around in the VC Delta format. The first time I ran Torkulna Grubs, we were using classic points, which meant I could easily slot in the powerful old Raylin at her absurdly affordable 80 points. But in VC Delta, she, at the time of the tournament, increased to 135 points, a 55-point increase. On top of that, the Marden Nagrubs went up from 30 to 35 points, making them more difficult to field as well. Torkulna thankfully stayed put at 220 points, but the increase in points to so many figures in the old version of my army got me exploring several variations of the build. The first change that came to mind was swapping out old Raylin for new Raylin. While old Raylin went up in points, new Raylin went down 20 points. Yes, her aura was less powerful, but it also had greater range, which could mean I wouldn't have to move her as much and could spend more time in a game activating the grubs. She also had that nice whirlwind assault power as an added bonus. If I ran Torkulna, 3 grubs, and new Raylin, that put me at 425 points in VC Delta, with 75 points left to spend. Intrigued, I began sorting through what I could afford. It was then that I found a 70-point VC unit that had a potentially powerful synergy with Torkulna, that being the Varkan and Wolf hero, Manalvi. In VC Delta, Manalvi was discounted a whopping 40 points from his classic cost, making him cheap enough to fit into the build. Manalvi's stats are fairly average for a hero, except for his very strong attack of 5, making him a second beatstick in my army alongside Torkulna. He also boasted some immunities for auto-wound, auto-destroy powers as a large-size figure, which was a nice bonus. But the powers on his card caught my attention the most. Charging Assault would buff his move to an impressive 8 so long as he could engage at the end of it, and Battle Frenzy gave him a small chance of attacking multiple times in a turn, which was appealing with that high attack. But I was most impressed by his Warrior's Charging Spirit, which would allow him, once killed, to buff any hero's movement by 2 points, as long as that hero had a range of 1. Naturally, I imagined that hero would be Torkulna, whose move would rise from 6 to 8. I thought this had a lot of potential with Torkulna's Trample Stomp power, giving the Hive Lord the potential of stomping 8 figures in one turn before he did his normal attack. Short of that ideal outcome, In general, I thought the extra move would be helpful in giving Torkulna positioning flexibility and in stomping more figures than he'd otherwise might have with 6 move. But this build presented a big problem, that being order marker flexibility. I would have to carefully manage order markers between 3 cards, Raylin, Manalvi, and the Grubs. In my previous version of this army, I typically moved Raylin once, then threw the rest of my markers on the Grubs, and pivoted to Samuel Brown for the endgame if I had to. Any army with Raylin lacks optimal order marker flexibility, but my old Grubs army was more manageable than the Manalvi version I was contemplating. My first instinct was to spend a few order markers on Manalvi in the early game to get him to engage a chunk of the enemy's army and hopefully do some damage with his attack. I would keep an X order marker on his card each round he survived into to make the opponent think I'd activate him and encourage the opponent to attack him instead of my other figures. That way, Manalvi would hopefully die early and I could plop his spirit on Torkulna. Once buffed by Manalvi, I'd then go all in on Torkulna Grubs, with an occasional marker on Raylin for positioning. It was all theory until I played the army against my friend Sammy, who, though not attending the tournament, ran his very strong Dwarves build against it in a practice game. The strategy worked relatively well. Manalvi rushed out early in the game and engaged Sammy's massive hero Mach on height, getting several wounds on him before he died. Then, Torkulna was charged up, and I sent him out with the Grubs. I don't remember all the details of that game, only that Sammy did turn it around and beat me. It was very close, but the build didn't prevail that time. Motivated largely by vanity, I played several more games against myself, pitting the Manalvi Grubs build against strong VC Delta armies I imagined it would go up against. And after several practice games with the Manalvi build, results were disappointing. I was losing roughly 2/3 of the games I played. While Manalvi did decent work at the start of each game, once he fell, Torkulna Grubs just didn't fare well against what was left. One of the problems with the Manalvi on Torkulna synergy is that while Torkulna could theoretically stomp a larger number of figures with the 8 move, that power is D20 reliant. The moment you fail on the roll, your movement ends. So the extra 2 move might not even come into play if you keep failing stomp chains, suggesting the 70 points spent on Manalvi would be better spent elsewhere. But the biggest reason this army wasn't working, I think, was the change of Raylin. New Raylin is useful, but just doesn't cut it in supporting the Hive Lord competitively in this build. The Grubs died much too quickly at only 3 defense, when with old Raylin they'd be buffed to 4. And Torkulna, similarly, took way too much damage way too quickly with only 6 defense, when previously he'd have 7 in old Raylin's aura. Because Torkulna can only heal 1 wound per turn, controlling his bleed is critical, and new Raylin just didn't do that well enough. With that revelation, I realized I would have to bite the bullet and accept the steep price increase for old Raylin. With Torkulna, 3 Grubs, and old Raylin, I had 40 points left to spend, and that didn't buy me much. However, it was enough to afford 1 more squad of Grubs, which I could do in this tournament because there was no restriction on the number of the same figure this time. I have generally found 3 to be a sufficient amount of Grubs to support a Raylin buff Torkulna over the course of a game. Anything less just doesn't offer the flexibility needed from the Grubs. And while more squads can be helpful, it's sometimes more than Torkulna needs or will survive long enough to make use of. But given how little points I had left, I thought the 4th squad made sense compared to what little else I could afford. 4 squads of Grubs was enough to fully heal Torkulna twice in a game, and meant all I was managing order markers between would be Raylin and the Grubs, and maybe Torkulna if he outlasted his snacks. Yes, the army lacked any range. Yes, it was going all in on Torkulna, but the affordability and fun I have running this army made me commit. Torkulna, 4 Grubs, and old Raylin. Motivated by the prospect of winning a 3rd consecutive tournament, I zealously grilled this army. I played it against several matchups I thought I'd face at the tournament. With old Raylin, it was winning the majority of them, even some that were less favorable, like armies with lots of range. As I practiced, I did something I'd never done before. I began compiling gameplay and strategy notes on how to play a particular army. But little worries nagged at me. Was I unwise to go all in on Torkulna this time? Should I have tried to fit in some range? Whatever the case, I was committed, and loaded my figures into their box for the big day. Performance notes and armies faced. This was another tournament I've forgotten a lot of details on, but I do remember at least the basic compositions of the armies I faced. Game 1. When the tournament started, the first army I was set against felt, once again, like punishment for a tier list ranking. Yet again, I found myself facing down a brood of Vanok Vipers, buffed by their warlord. I don't remember the other support that came with this army, and the reasons for that may become clear soon. While I had come to fear and respect the Vipers in high volumes, this matchup was a bit better than when I faced the brood with Firestorm. Firestorm simply lacked the numbers to counter the Vipers in the melee-only tournament, but my Torkulna Grubs army was better equipped in that regard. In addition, the ordinarily weak attack of the Grubs was more than enough to reliably kill the Vipers with zero defense. Plus, if played well, my entire army would be buffed by Raylin, so the Vipers, even while frenzying, would hopefully struggle to do damage. And all of this before accounting for the powerhouse that is Torkulna. Overall, while not ideal, I thought I stood a chance. But this was another game I played very poorly in. The map had elevated lava in the center, which the Vipers were able to skirt around with ease using their 9 move. There were also small islands surrounded by water on either side of the map that contained glyphs, which the Vipers could grab and control with ease. I was seriously regretting not bringing range to take out those Vipers on the glyphs, as without range, I had no strategically sound path to getting them off. Even if I got lucky with a stray grub splashing into the water and killing the Viper on the glyph, another Viper would just rocket up from the back and replace him, and would get a hide attack on the grub I sent out to deal with the original glyph holder. No, in this situation, I made the same call I did in the Firestorm Vipers game. Set up a position, and hunker down. The ruins in my start zone made setting up that position challenging. Raylin needed to have eyes on the board beyond my start zone, which meant she had to fly out beyond the ruins to extend her aura. But I made the fatal error of putting her next to an elevated hex, allowing any Viper that got there to get a hide attack on her. The idea was I'd have enough figures there to guard that hex and prevent that from happening, but with the frenzying Vipers, who, if I recall correctly, controlled a glyph of Lodin, they could kill any guards I sent to protect Raylin, then frenzy and get hide attacks on her. The Vipers came in waves, usually a set of 3 at a time. Torkulna and the Grubs did fairly well in the beginning, often killing each wave without too much difficulty, but the Vipers got off an insane amount of frenzies, which allowed them to compromise my position and start whacking Raylin. As bad a position as she was in, I made the call not to spend an order marker on her to get her out. It was too important to bond with Torkulna Grubs and send out my offense to offset the Viper incursion's progress on my army. Eventually, Raylin was slain, and my whole army lost its armor. Once that happened, Torkulna started taking on wounds faster than he could heal, and more Grubs died to Viper attacks. I recall a brief window in the battle where it looked like things might have been tilted in my favor, but I just couldn't swing it. There weren't many Vanok Vipers left at the end of the game, but even if they had all perished, Vanok Warlord likely would have finished the game anyway. I lost another match to the Vipers. But it wasn't as big a sweep as it was when I played Firestorm. The Vipers aren't the worst matchup for Torkulna Grubs with Raylin, and had I protected the Kyrie Warrior better, I may have been able to turn things around. But I didn't. Not the greatest start to that day. Game 2. The second game that day was against an army I thought was a much, much worse matchup for my own. An army I remember the exact composition of. I was facing a range-heavy army composed of 3 squads of Guerrillinators, the Nikita agents, the VC Premedon hero Zaus, and Marku Essenwine and Otonashi as support filler. I had heard good things about the Zaus-Nikita Guerrillinators combo. While the Nikitas could move the Naders on their turn, Zaus could activate the Naders' attack phase on his turn. So if a player was splitting order markers between Nikitas and Zaus, they could take complete turns with the Guerrillinators, split up across at least 2 order markers. It's a cool build, one that I appreciate for making the previously hard-to-field Guerrillinators a lot more competitively viable. And with its high mobility and range, it would be a tough matchup for Torkulna Grubs to overcome. The map we played on was wide, with a large hill in the center. There was a glyph on a road in a valley below the hill, but before placing order markers, I thought it best to focus my efforts on securing height to dilute the power of ranged attacks, rather than go for the glyph. I knew I'd be taking a lot of fire on my way up the hill, likely losing several Grubs on the way there, but if I could just take the hill and hold it, maybe I could prevail. As the game started, there was no avoiding the fast development of my opponent's figures. The Guerrillinators with their 7 moves swiftly secured the glyph and started shooting at my Grubs. I recall moving Raylin forward just enough that she covered my side of the hill with her aura to protect Torkulna grubs on their hike. However, this also put her in range of the Naders and Nikitas, who took plenty of shots at her. I recall sending a couple of grubs to try and get the Naders off the glyph, but since they could so quickly move figures to secure the glyph after one died, I gave up and focused all my grubs on defending Torkulna. Moving Raylin up early was a serious mistake, however, as she fell early after concentrated fire from my opponent's ranged attacks. Torkulna had made decent progress up the hill, but with Raylin gone, things were looking dire. I had some fortune of Torkulna taking out the Nikitas and securing the hill as I had hoped to. But then came Zeus, the great Primadon scientist, who threatened a huge portion of the board with his mighty railgun special attack. I had known of Zeus as a unit, and skimmed his card prior to playing him that day, but I didn't fully appreciate the power of that railgun attack. I just saw it in my head as a strong attack of 4 at 7 range, which would prove a catastrophic oversight. My opponent positioned Zeus very well, forcing me to come to him, but also ensuring I'd need to expend several turns to engage him while walking through a valley where he'd get several height attacks on Torkulna and my grubs. Though my opponent had lost the hill, he'd taken another, smaller hill with Zeus, and because I had no range, he again dictated the area we'd fight in. It wasn't looking good, but I had to give it my all. This was when my failure to understand Zeus's railgun came back to bite me. I'd been trained through many Torkulna grubs games to surround Torkulna with at least 1 or 2 grubs to ensure he could heal wounds next turn, but Zeus was a figure that, had I understood his special attack better, I should have reevaluated my approach for. My Torkulna was seriously injured by that point in the game, but still had a few grubs left to heal up. I rallied my remaining grubs around Torkulna to attempt one last push to hopefully take out Zeus. But then, my opponent targeted one of my grubs adjacent to Torkulna with Zeus's railgun, and rolled a whopping 4 attack. This instantly vaporized the grub, and, because all excess skulls on the railgun count as unblockable hits on an adjacent figure, transferred 2 auto wounds onto Torkulna, which was enough to kill him. I don't remember much of the game after that because there wasn't much of a game after that. My opponent not only played his army very well, but I played very poorly by not anticipating a move like that. I was on a losing streak, and would need to win my next 2 games to have any shot at the playoffs. Game 3. Following my disastrous defeat at the hands of Zeus, I went up against an army that contained Grimnak and a core of heavy gruts. I don't remember the full composition of the army, nor do I remember most details of this game. If my memory serves, the map was one made from just one Rise of the Valkyrie master set, so no special terrain rules were in effect. The main moment I remember from this match was when my opponent had secured a strong position behind a ruin in which his heavies were controlling a glyph and blocking me from engaging the glyph holders. The corridor was narrow, which made it easy for Grimnak to chomp my grubs, but it also made it easy for Torkulna to stomp the heavies. I had Raylin close to the fray to provide her aura, but also a bit too close for my liking as the heavies advance. With their disengage, I remember some heavies dancing around Torkulna and my grubs to get very strong attacks on my Hive Lord. There was also a moment I recall where my opponent's Grimnak was within striking distance of Raylin, and with a lucky chomp roll, he could one-shot her. Torkulna managed to kill the Orc champion before that happened, but the skirmish in that area of the board was nerve-wracking. Eventually though, Torkulna was able to tank long enough to stomp through the heavies, and the grubs soon overpowered the glyph holder. Once that skirmish behind the ruin was decided, my team mopped up the rest of my opponent's units. It was my first win of the day, and meant I still had a chance at entering the playoffs if I won my next 2 games. Game 4. My next game was against a build I had a feeling I'd be facing that day, one centered around the Capuan gladiators and some gladiator heroes. I had played against versions of this army in practice games, and had won most of them, if only narrowly. I was surprised to see this time that my opponent had left behind Spartacus in favor of extra Capuans and the VC gladiator Tetraides. This meant that his army wouldn't be powered up in stats with Spartacus's gladiator inspiration. While certainly a comfort, Tetraides was nothing to sneeze at, as his spiked gauntlet could tear through my grubs, and my Raylin would be a juicy target for his finishing blow if he ever engaged her. Plus, my opponent's army now had more Capuans to work through than it would have had he brought Spartacus. And then there was Crixus. I don't know any serious competitive gladiator army that doesn't include this absolute unit of a figure. In the notes I'd taken during my practice games with Torkulna grubs, I noted Crixus as one of the high danger units I might have to face, and prepared a specific contingency plan for if he showed up. My fear was that if he engaged Torkulna, my Hive Lord would be wasting his Mighty 6 attack on a unit that was likely only taking a single wound per turn with 1 shield defense. If Crixus showed, my plan was to intercept him and surround him with grubs, to keep him away from Torkulna and hopefully wear him down on lives. Only once Crixus was down to no more than 2 lives would I engage him with Torkulna, as Torkulna stood a good chance of stomping a wound onto him and then doing at least 1 wound of damage with his 6 attack to finish him off. The grubs also made sense as an answer to Crixus as cheap figures to waste his high attack on, and because they could swarm him and nip at his legs until he blanked on defense, thereby allowing the grubs to bypass 1 shield defense. The map featured a central choke point of even level land, which immediately jumped out at me as the area to control. Torkulna thrives in even level corridors where he can't be easily surrounded and where he can set up for trample chains. So I made it my goal to flood the area with grubs and secure it for Torkulna to start stomping. Both my opponent and I seemed to value the center of the map and rushed our figures towards it. My forces were slightly faster and secured it first, but the gladiators had a good defensive position of their own. Additionally, I had to give up a turn on the grubs to move in Raylin and set her up for her aura. Unfortunately, this also left her vulnerable to an attack from one of the mighty gladiator heroes nearby. As Crixus approached, I used my strategy and jumped him with a squad of grubs, keeping him from Raylin. I believe I then used Torkulna to deal with Tetrades, as the Utgar gladiator special powers were of no use on a huge figure. Torkulna was doing steady stomp damage on the Compuids nearby, and overall my army was sustaining a healthy momentum. Each turn I'd activate at least 1 grub on Crixus to try for a wound on him. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but I threw so many grubs at him that his lives were slowly worn down. I forget if grubs or Torkulna took him out, but eventually he fell. Pretty soon, I powered through the rest of the Capuans and Tetrades. Admittedly, with the central choke point, the map was favorable to my build, but it was a reminder how important it is to protect Raylin for this army. My first 2 losses that day were games that I didn't guard Raylin carefully enough, and now my first 2 wins were ones that I did. I was still in the running for the playoffs after this win. If I could win my next game, I'd qualify. Game 5. My 5th game that day is one that I really wished I took pictures of. The map we were playing on was absolutely beautiful, filled with varied terrain and a mechanically interesting layout. I don't know if it was from one of the tournament approved lists, but it was a pleasure to play on. The map consisted of a large hill accessible via a road path and a valley with a lake beneath it. On the lake was a small island with a glyph. This time I was up against an army of all heroes: Alistair McDurk, Crixus, Kelda, New Raylin, and Tandros Creel. While this army had 0 order marker flexibility, these were some powerful heroes I'd be facing down, 3 of which were melee heavy hitters. The Kelda Raylin support combo backing them up was also concerning, and it even had range with Tandros. The map was designed such that if a player wanted to go straight for their opponent's side of the board, they'd have to traverse the lake, which would take time and put them in a vulnerable position. While the option to go for the glyph was available, I thought it best not to devote the resources to doing that, as I couldn't reach it in a single turn with the lake surrounding the island. Instead, I thought it would be best to take the hill as quickly as possible. This game played out very differently than I thought it would. 2 of my early plays were to move Raylin and Torkulna up onto the hill, screening both with grubs. Raylin was the farthest back onto the hill, while Torkulna moved over to my opponent's side of the hilltop. He was still a few hexes back, but he had a commanding view of my opponent's start zone. Because my opponent's army was such that he could only move 1 figure per turn, I was developing much faster than he was. He was gathering his 3 heavy hitters into an area at the bottom of the hill in his Raylin's aura, with Kelda able to reach any of them in a single turn nearby. Because I had no range, I would have to come down and face him eventually. But in order to get Torkulna and my Raylin up onto the hill as quickly as possible, I had to leave the majority of my grubs back at base. Rather than make a hasty charge into his position, I instead waited on the hill. I gave up several turns attacking with Torkulna, simply leaving him where he was and spending those turns on my remaining grubs so that they could catch up. My opponent's slow-moving army was making gestures toward the hill, as if preparing his own charge to climb it. But after many turns of keeping Torkulna put, I had amassed all of my grubs up onto the hill, dutifully surrounding their Hive Lord. It was then that I charged, hurling Torkulna into the fray to smash everything he could with a pack of grubs in tow. Using the same anti-Crixus strategy I applied last game, I mobbed Crixus with grubs to keep him from Torkulna. Crixus, I recall, had taken height, and so he was fending off the grubs well. But every now and then, an attack would land, and Crixus was slowly dying. I also remember my opponent rolling a very unfortunate 1 on a Kelda heal roll, which I believe killed Alistair McDurk. Torkulna and the grubs mopped up the rest of the army fairly quickly after that, winning the game. This is a game I think back to often because it was a situation in which I spent many turns not using full order marker utility in favor of building up a strong position. It was a patient game in which I sacrificed turns on Torkulna to protect him, waiting for the right moment to strike, the right moment when he'd be properly supported by all of his grubs. And, in this matchup, it worked. I'm not sure how viable it would have been to give up Torkulna attacks if I was facing a more mobile army, but here, the slow, careful play paid off. And with this third win, I had qualified for the playoffs. I felt my luck beginning to turn. My goal of getting a third consecutive first place was still within grasp. Game 6. It was time for the first game of the playoffs. These were the armies that had done especially well that day, and my next matchup was an unsurprising playoff contender, a mixture of 4th Massachusetts Line, Knights of Weston, and Sir Denric. I think Eldgrim the Viking Champion was in this army as well, but I can't confirm. Either way, these were some high-quality units, with a hero killer like Denric, who would be strong into Torkulna. As the game got going, my opponent moved up his 4th Mass onto height and set them up for powerful weight-than-fire shots. Several early shots went straight into Raylin, severely injuring but not killing her. I chose to spend my early order markers on my grubs, and seeing the gunfire the 4th Mass were sending towards my important support unit, I rushed Torkulna in to start killing as many of them as possible. If I recall correctly, I actually rushed Torkulna out of Raylin's aura to take out multiple 4th Mass. I knew the risk I was taking in doing this, but I thought if I could remove my opponent's range, then I'd have an easier time protecting Raylin and confronting his hardy knights. The 4th Mass continued their shots into Raylin and brought her down to 1 life, but she hung on, and Torkulna mopped up the remainder of their ranks. But as Torkulna was killing the Mass, my opponent had been developing his knights, knowing the 4th Mass were a lost cause. I knew then that I had to keep Denric from engaging Torkulna to prevent Giant Killer from triggering. Using my grubs approach to Crixus from earlier, I swarmed Denric with grubs and got some wounds on him. I do think, however, Denric managed to engage Torkulna at least once and may have put some damage on him. In any case, Torkulna was at risk of entering one of the worst situations he could be in, surrounded from all sides by knights, whose Coward's Reward power made trample stomping an extremely risky maneuver. I forget exactly how, but through careful positioning, I was able to keep Torkulna from getting too heavily mobbed by knights. My grubs helped guard Torkulna's flanks and slow down approaching knights to limit the number of attackers the Hive Lord had to deal with at any one time. And with his trample stomp and 6 attack, Torkulna was once again sustaining a steady killing momentum that, eventually, I rode to the endgame and finally to victory. This was a tense game that really could have swung against me had Raylin bought the dust earlier, so luck was involved in my win here. Had a few key plays not gone in my favor in the mid-game, my opponent could have taken this one. But I took the win with Torkulna and a healthy amount of grubs still on the board. I was still in the running for the championship, but needed to win my next game to get there. Game 7. The next game of the playoffs showed just how hard a third first-place tournament win was going to be. I was once again up against the Gorillinator army that had trounced me earlier that day. Small wonder it too had gotten this far into the playoffs. This was the game I needed to win to make the championship. But I was wiser this time around, knowing that when Zaus started moving in, to keep my grubs away from Torkulna to guard against his railgun. That's an unfortunate position for Torkulna to be in, but the matchup demanded I play that way. The map was a bit more favorable this time as well, with lots of jungle to buff my grubs from ranged attacks. It was also a bit more concise than the first map I fought the Naders on, meaning they couldn't move as widely and as freely as they had prior. But my opponent was skilled, and his army was no slouch. If I was going to win, it would be through blood, sweat, and tears. I moved Raylin up early to set up her aura, then spent the rest of my markers on Torkulna grubs to advance under her protection. But quickly, I realized I made a mistake. My opponent was going to develop faster than I would regardless of what I did, and by moving Raylin forward early, that just helped my opponent reach her with range more quickly. Sure enough, he sent his naders to gun her down, and she died early once again. Not a good start at all. Unfortunately, the battle was moving so quickly that Tarkulna was outpacing most of the grubs he'd left behind in my start zone, and a Tarkulna without the support of either grubs or Raylin is sure to fall fast. I recall my trample rolls weren't coming through for me that game, so I had to rely on my 6 attack, which was doing work. I recall taking out the Nikitas early and whacking some naders with grubs, but my opponent took lava height with his figures, and Zeus was moving in. Tarkulna was injured, but still surprisingly hanging in there. As Zeus approached, I scattered my grubs, hoping they could take out some naders nearby. Zeus claimed height on Tarkulna, but didn't kill him. I recall at the end of the round the lava wounding Zeus, which meant that if Tarkulna could get one strong whack in on the Primadon Engineer, that might be enough to kill him. Then came the pivotal initiative roll of the game. If I won, I might be able to kill Zeus, and then start healing Tarkulna with my large reserves of grubs back in my start zone. But if my opponent won, Zeus would likely take down Tarkulna, and then it was game. We rolled for initiative, and sadly, I lost. Soon after, Zeus and the Naders slayed the Great Hive Lord, and I was left with a bunch of leaderless grubs, not much more than headless chickens at this point. My opponent quickly mopped up my remains, and I was knocked out of the championship. A blow, but one that was coming to me. I put myself in the position of relying on initiative dice rolls to turn things around. Had I better protected Raylin and moved up my grubs more carefully, I think Tarkulna would have tanked long enough to take out Zeus. My opponent built a very good army, and played it well, and his advancement to the championship was well earned. Still, I had qualified for the game that would determine 3rd and 4th place for the tournament, and walking away with 3rd place would yield me one of the prizes, so I was eager to finish the day strong. Game 8. My last game that day was against another army filled with strong units. I recall it having at least 3 squads of Phantom Knights and 1 Fen Hydra, with a Sahuagin Raider for filler. There were other units in the mix, but I forget which. In addition to whoever won 3rd place, my opponent and I would both get 3rd and 4th picks of what was left in the prize pool, and there were some official figures neither of us had in the pool that we were both eyeing. My opponent had me beat on mobility with his Phantom Knights, whose 6th move with stealth flying let them go wherever they pleased. We were fighting on the same map I'd faced the Heavy Gruts on earlier, and I sent my army to the same section of the map I'd brawled with the Orcs on that day. Tarkulna and his grubs, within Raylin's aura, had huddled near a ruin piece, with the Phantom Knights flying over and slashing away at the grubs. The arena was good for Tarkulna to stomp in, and the Hive Lord and his grubs cut through the Phantom Knights almost as soon as they arrived. The Phantom Knights did, however, get some wounds in on Raylin, though she did survive. This is where I wish I remembered my opponent's army better, because I recall him using a ranged unit after his push with the Phantom Knights, which forced me to leave my encampment to hunt them down. It may have been the Krav Maga agents, but I can't say for sure. In any case, my opponent spent several of his order markers on this ranged unit, but I noticed that while doing so, he'd left the entire round without a single marker on the Fen Hydra. Knowing how significant a danger that monster posed, I decided to send Tarkulna out to attack it while it wasn't being activated, hopefully doing enough wounds to knock down the number of times per turn it could attack. I then sent out some grubs to deal with the ranged attackers across the map. The maneuver was successful, injuring the Hydra, though not killing it. I believe by the end of the round it had 2 lives left, with only 2 attacks possible per turn, far preferable to 4. On the next round, my opponent realized he needed his Hydra to do something that game. Tarkulna and the Hydra brawled for a bit, with the Hive Lord taking a lot of damage. It's worth noting that in pursuit of that opportunity to strike the Hydra, I rushed Tarkulna and his grubs out of Raylin's aura. I figured I wouldn't have a better opportunity to attack it than that, and that was worth the risk of leaving Raylin's protection. In the past, abandoning Raylin for a juicy target would buy me the farm, but in this scenario, it was a play that worked. Tarkulna took down the Hydra, but without Raylin, he got injured quite a bit himself. I didn't have many grubs left, and my opponent's Sahuagin Raider, a unit that likes attacking already injured heroes, got a chance to attack Tarkulna. I think it did 1 wound, but not enough to kill, and the Hive Lord swiftly punished the Raider by pounding him to death on his next turn. In the end, I took the win, as well as 3rd place for the tournament. Not the 1st place I had hoped for, but a good end to the day. And from the prize pool, I took home the D&D hero Eltahale from official Heroscape, a figure I had long wanted but didn't have in my collection. My opponent, who came in 4th place, actually wanted the other figure I hadn't chosen, Saelin the Kyrie Warrior, so it worked out for both of us. My 1st place streak had broken, but I was still pleased with how Tarkulna Grubs had performed. Takeaways and conclusion. The biggest takeaway from this tournament was just how much fun I have with the Torkulna Grubs and Old Raylin combo. Of all the armies I've played across all of Heroscape, I think this one might be my favorite from a mechanical standpoint. There's just something I enjoy about king armies conceptually, the idea of an entire army purely dedicated to the protection of one gigantic powerhouse figure. It makes for an exciting game dynamic where you're not only worried about beating your opponent, but also balancing the survival of your king with maximizing his offensive output over the course of a fight. There's an exciting tension that builds as you constantly fear for your Torkulna's life, but also relish those moments where he rips the opponent's forces to shreds if well protected. But it's an army that comes with challenges. Despite the one game where I abandoned Raylin to go for the Hydra, I still think she and her first incarnation is essential to the build. Yes, on rare occasions you might leave her behind, but you need to have her there for the majority of matchups you're going to face. And with her significant increase in points cost in Delta, the entire army becomes tough to field in the VC Delta format. I've heard it said that in classic points, the ideal version of this army is Torkulna, 3 squads of Grubs, Old Raylin, and the Krav Maga agents, which comes out to 490 points in classic Heroscape. But at the time of this video, that army is 580 points in VC Delta. If Torkulna, 3 Grubs, and Old Raylin are non-negotiables no matter the points format, then that would only leave 40 points in a 500-point game, which doesn't buy a lot. The Krav Maga are great in any army, but they're particularly good with Torkulna Grubs as range support that they need. If I had the Krav Maga on my games with the Guerrillinators, I at least would have been able to force my opponent to move around and get closer to me, where I could then lay into him with Torkulna. Without range, my ranged opponents dictated the terms of engagement. It may then be argued that the ideal Torkulna Grubs army isn't viable in VC Delta, which is a shame. However, I was still pleased with how my army played in its all-melee version. Sure, some of its potential matchups were now really bad, but I enjoyed the flexibility the extra squad of Grubs gave me. Extra attacks, extra heals on Torkulna, extra meat shields to keep the dangerous attackers from engaging my Hive Lord, just as the vile Morrow race intended. The other big takeaway was my Raylin positioning in early game against range-heavy armies. Both games against the Naders I moved Raylin up early, which, as I shared, just made it easier for the enemy range to get to her. In melee-only matchups, early Raylin movement may be more advisable, but against range, I think it might be best, at least for the first round or so, to slow roll the army. This is only a theory, and one I'd need to test more, but I think the play in those matchups is to put Raylin as far forward in your start zone as possible. Then, spend all of round 1 on Torkulna Grubs, advancing them slowly within her aura. With 4 squads, you can afford to lose a few to early enemy ranged fire, but hopefully an unmoved Raylin will force the opponent closer to your Torkulna Grubs formation. If your opponent does overextend his range in this way, with the aim of getting to Raylin, then I think Torkulna will more likely be in striking distance. And most range doesn't stand a chance against Torkulna in melee. It's tough decisions and precise plays like this that endear this army to me. You need to invest a lot of thought and planning into the protection of your Hive Lord, but do that work, and he will pay it back in kind. This is another pet army in addition to the Amber Hive Protectors that I'd like to explore more deeply, and so do let me know if a miniseries on specific army builds is of interest, and I'll add it to this channel's projects. All in all, another great day of Scape. Final score, 5 wins, 3 losses. December 16th, 2023. And so came our group's final tournament of 2023. Several of the attendees brought prizes to add to a nice prize pool, fittingly so for the holiday season. Rules and format. Once again, the format was VC Delta, but with a new restriction, heroes only. We would have 500 points to spend on a squadless team, which means we'd be ending the year with a tournament we could truly call Heroscape. Because of the format, instead of power glyphs, we would be using a set of treasure glyphs, specifically Talisman of Defense, Heroic Rune, Brooch of Shielding, and Potion of Healing, which unique and uncommon heroes could pick up. My army. I remember spending a lot of time thinking about the exact composition of my army for this event. With the lack of squads, the number of figure activations per turn in this tournament was going to be small, likely no more than 2 to 3 in a turn. Often, strong tournament armies have some type of bonding power, or a similar power that allows for some order marker flexibility. Rather than do a hodgepodge of different heroes I liked thrown together into one army, I thought the right call was to build my army around some kind of bonding hero core. Heroes only just meant no squad figures, so unique, uncommon, and common heroes were all available to draft. One of my first thoughts was to build a Wyrmling army, with the Wyrmlings as an army core supported by more powerful heroes. While Wyrmlings can only bond with other Wyrmlings, their bonding powers would allow me to mix and match different types of Wyrmlings for different jobs. With the order mark of flexibility they provided, I decided on some type of Wyrmling build. Pretty quickly, I eliminated the red Wyrmlings from consideration, as the main reason to draft them is to counter common squad figures, which wouldn't show up in this tournament. That left black, blue, and white Wyrmlings on the table. While the white Wyrmlings are the toughest of the worms with their 4 defense, and have impressive range with their fledgling Ice Shard special attack, they too seem better as an army core if going up against squads, where toughness against a high volume of attacks is more desirable. That left me with the black and blue Wyrmlings. Of the two, I was more drawn to the blue Wyrmlings. In classic points, I've seen many say that the blue worms are the worst of the lot. That always perplexed me, because they have the highest base attack of 4. I suppose I can understand that view, with the blue worms being the most expensive to field in classic points, and the fact that their fledgling Lightning Breath special attack, while handy at times, does force them to get dangerously close to the fray. But in VC Delta, the blue Wyrmlings went down at the time of this video from 35 to 30 points. This meant once I had drafted 6 blue Wyrmlings into my army, I'd have spent 30 points less than I would have in classic points, meaning I could afford a 7th blue Wyrmling in VC Delta. Additionally, there was a good chance that some of the figures I'd go up against would be powerful, tanky heroes with high defense that I'd need strong attacks to puncture, like the dreaded Major Q9. So a core of at least 7 blue Wyrmlings seemed like the right call for this event. But I was also interested in the venerable black Wyrmlings, whose potential to deliver 1 or 2 auto wounds to small and medium figures at range seemed like important equipment to have in my toolbox. Specifically, I imagined the black worms as an answer to Nigoxa, a high defense medium figure that I thought had a good chance of showing because most Heroscape players have Nigoxa in their collections, and the day would be filled with unique and uncommon heroes a Nigoxa could try to mind-shackle. The question was, how many black Wyrmlings, if any, to bring along? My 2 friends Alex and Sammy would be attending this event as well, and I bounced ideas off of Sammy for my army as well as his. Sammy argued that I should go all in on blue Wyrmlings with their high attack, a version of the build I was strongly considering. But I just couldn't shake the sense that a few black Wyrmlings would be useful at some point in the day. I tabled the question of my Wyrmling composition for later and began brainstorming other heroes I'd bring along with me. As good as the Wyrmlings are, they alone wouldn't be able to take on the powerhouse figures that were probably going to show up that day. I needed a heavy hitter, something with high attack, high survivability, or both, who could go toe-to-toe with the Q9 or Nilfheim if needed. Additionally, I needed some unique or uncommon heroes to grab treasure glyphs, should the opportunity arise to do so in battle. At first, I thought of Eltahale, the figure I won in the last tournament. She had good stats, including a respectable 5 attack, with some neat powers to boot. But then I realized in VC Delta, she was the same price as the new version of Sergeant Drake Alexander, a figure with the same stats as Eltahale, except for a higher attack of 6. Plus, Drake had Grapple Arm, which offered him movement flexibility, Thorian Speed, which made him invulnerable to normal ranged attacks, and Pistol Fire special attack, which gave him a ranged attack option. An attractive draft indeed, especially at only 145 points, discounted 25 from Classic. Drake could run through a gauntlet of ranged fire and deliver a smackdown on a high-value target in the enemy lines. And with Grapple Arm, he could dance around his opponents to try and snag height for a whopping 7 attack. But as appealing as New Drake was, his valuable Thorian Speed could be bypassed by ranged special attacks, which I expected there would be a lot of in Heroes only. Plus, as a medium figure, he was vulnerable to auto-wound and auto-destroy powers some heroes possess. I then began exploring other options for my heavy hitter. While searching, I came across another hero that offered a powerful synergy with the blue Wyrmlings, that being the VC Kairi hero, Emperor Andask. With Andask's Orb of Vengeance power, once per turn, I could reroll dice that didn't show skulls on a melee attack, so long as the attacking figure was within 4 spaces of Andask. And because each Wyrmling takes a full turn before it bonds with another Wyrmling, if 2 blue Wyrmlings were activated within Andask's aura, then that would mean 2 attacks of 4 that I could reroll once for each, potentially 2 attacks of 5 with rerolls if on height. While an investment of 110 points to draft Andask, that investment would make normal attacks spent on blue Wyrmlings much more potent. Despite this, after playing around with Andask in different blue Wyrmling configurations, I thought it was better to have more blue Wyrmlings with less chance of doing damage than fewer worms with higher chances of doing damage. The Wyrmlings were my foot soldiers, and as such were the most expendable units in my army. If I brought Andask, that would mean protecting the blue worms would be more important. Not an easy task when each blue worm has only 1 life and 3 defense. To give my army extra expendable units I wouldn't be too afraid to lose in the heat of battle, I decided to pass on Andask. This was something Sammy was recommending too, for the same reasons. It was sometime after dropping Andask that I began eyeing another VC unit, the recently released Jandar hero, Exensia. The mighty Phoenix caught my attention for a number of reasons. First, I owned her figure. She intrigued me the moment she came out with her Phoenix Rising power, which effectively gave her an astounding 12 lives. I won't go too deep into the mechanics of it here, but it essentially simulates the concept of a phoenix slowly burning itself to death, only to be reborn as a fully formed bird afterwards. Her first 6 lives she's burning away, then, once exhausted, her remaining 6 lives she's reborn a giant bird. I found a good deal on eBay for the figure and sprung for it earlier in 2023, not realizing I might actually consider her down the road for a tournament. Exensia was by far the most expensive hero I had considered for this team so far at 180 points. This was both her official and VC Delta price, as she was so new at the time that no rebalancing had yet been applied to her. Maybe that would come in time, but either way, I would be paying 180 points if I wanted her in my army for this event, and she would fill the same role I was considering New Drake for as my powerful, heavy-hitting hero. One of Exensia's downsides is that she currently has no synergies within the VC expanded roster of units, so if you draft her, you really are only drafting her for what's on her card and nothing else. But her card is impressive. In addition to those effective 12 lives, she has 6 move with flying and a strong 5 attack. Her immolation power gives her the chance to do auto wounds to figures around her and, unfortunately, also to herself. But when she loses her first 6 lives, that triggers an explosion power that has a high likelihood of auto wounding anyone within 2 spaces of her figure. Plus, she represents an extremely rare type of unit in that she's a single space huge size figure. Not only would this give her several immunities, but it meant that positioning her would be very easy. When comparing her to New Drake, despite the increase in points cost, Exensia began to look more favorable for this event. She was immune to many of the auto-wound powers small and medium figures are susceptible to, powers I feared might show in a heroes only event. Yes, she had a slightly weaker base attack than Drake, but 5 was still plenty to work with, especially since she'd be easy to set up on height with her 6 move, flying, and single space size. Where Exensia started to make eminent sense to draft was in the fact that she could be an excellent treasure glyph grabber. With her high survivability, she'd hang on to any treasure glyph she obtained for many turns, denying them from the opponent. Once I realized this, I was sold. I wasn't concerned with the fact that she didn't synergize with anything. New Drake didn't synergize with my army either. Her immolation and explosion abilities were just icing on the cake. Exensia was to be my big hero for the day, which I liked aesthetically, since as a flying figure she had a certain thematic compatibility with the Wormling brood I was planning on bringing. Now I just had to figure out what that brood would be composed of. I was either going all in on blue Wormlings, or doing mostly blue Wormlings with a few black Wormlings. And as easy as it would have been to do only blue worms, I really thought that at least 2 black worms would better equip me for a wider array of possible matchups, especially against Negaxa if he showed up. When looking at the points of the units, I could draft 8 blue Wormlings, 2 black Wormlings, and Exensia for 490 points. With that, I decided on the 8 blue, 2 black Wormling configuration. With my remaining 10 points, my last choice was clear. No way I wasn't ending my first year of Heroscape tournaments without Ball in my army, and so I confirmed my build. A Ball build with Exensia, 8 blue Wormlings, and 2 black Wormlings as my 490 points of filler. Performance notes and armies faced. I do remember a good amount of what happened at this event, and several people at the event helped record all of the armies that were in play, so I'll do my best to capture what I recall here. Game 1. My first game that day was against an army of 4 different heroes with no particular synergies, but they were all strong units in their own regard. Helming the opponent's force was the mighty Q9, with Agent Skahan and Savaris as powerful ranged backup, and Eldgrim as a high-utility filler unit. Q9, as is always the case, was a unit I was worried I'd have to face down. While I had something of a response in Exensia's 5 attack that had a reasonable chance of wounding Q9, I was starting to miss Drake's 6 attack in such a scenario. Still, once the game got going, things were looking positive. My blue and black Wormlings moved out first, spreading out across the board and setting up for attacks into my opponent's smaller figures. I knew they had little chance of getting through Q9, so I thought I should have them remove the Vidar Solborg's allies to isolate him against the rest of my forces. And the Wormlings did just that. Without Agent Skahan or Savaris moving too far outside their start zones, the Wyrmlings took them both down. I certainly lost a few Wyrmlings in the process, but I still had a few left over after the push. I forget where Eldgrim factored into the game. I think he might have been sent out to grab a glyph, as he's wont to do. And I forget where my opponent placed him when he died. I'm pretty sure it was on Q9, but not certain. Either way, it soon came down to Q9 versus Exensia, my last few Wyrmlings, and Ball. Exensia had developed a bit during the game and had been slightly injured due to ranged fire and her own immolation power, but she was still in the burning phase of her 12 lives and could do explosion damage on Q9 if she engaged him before she blew up. There were treasure glyphs on the map as well, but they were so far away from the action that they didn't seem worth the effort, even if one of them might be a heal potion. The problem was, if I sent Exensia to get them, that would give Q9 an opportunity to take a big height buff normal attack on her, which I wanted to avoid. Instead, I rushed her in to engage Q9. My opponent forced me onto even level, and I had to hope my 5 attack could slowly get through Q9's incredible 7 defense. But the odds just weren't in my favor. Q9's Queglix gun gave him 3 attacks of 3 each turn, compared to my 1 attack of 5. And too often, my 5 attack just wasn't getting through his defense. With Exensia's own self-damage during her burning phase, along with her low defense of 3, Q9 cut through her life count pretty quickly with Queglix. It wasn't long before Exensia bought the farm. I do remember her doing a few wounds on Q9, but not enough to kill. That left Ball as my only figure to go up against the Major. The little goblin did have Ankle Shank, which had saved me before against a Krug in the very end game. If Ball could engage and roll hot on his attack, there was a slim chance he could do it. Much as I wanted to see that happen, it didn't. Q9 easily outranged the goblin and gunned him down. It was a relatively close game, but still a loss, and not how I wanted to start the day. Game 2. I forget whether this was my second or third game that day, but I do have notes on the composition of my opponent's army. It was an assortment of heroes: Deathwalker 8000, Kimoshi, Shiori, Sanlin, and Nigaxa. Indeed, the tanky Maro Warlord had showed up, and I was very glad I had brought my Black Wyrmlings in response. Looking at that army, Heroscape's 2 Mindshacklers were in play. The good news was I had lots of common heroes that could keep the Mindshacklers at bay and hopefully take them out before they could engage Exensia. But if they engaged her and got off a successful Mindshackle, then the game was my opponent's to win. To avoid that, I opened with my Wyrmlings. Putting all order markers on my blue Wyrmlings allowed me the flexibility to take at least one turn with a black Wyrmling. Really, they were mainly there for Nigaxa, as the blue worms had a good shot at getting through Kimoshi, Sanlin, and Shiori's defenses. 8000, I imagine, could be handled by Exensia once the smaller heroes were dealt with. I could be misremembering, but I may have gotten lucky and killed 8000 with a Wyrmling attack, but not sure. Either way, the Black Wyrmling investment paid off. They didn't last long, but they did significant damage through their Acid Breath power into Nigaxa. A few blue Wyrmling attacks after finished off the Maro Warlord, and the remaining blues dealt with Kimoshi as well. With the Shacklers dead, I felt safe to move in Exensia. The Great Phoenix handled what was left well, and brought me a win for the day. Game 3. Again, I forget the sequence of games during the mid part of the day, but I remember this specific army I faced. It was the smallest I fought that day, with only 3 heroes: Charos, Heracles, and Kelda. 2 massively powerful brawlers with a healer. This army had me pretty nervous going into it, especially Heracles backed by Kelda. That VC powerhouse hero had tools against my entire army. He could kill my Wyrmlings with Throw, and his Labors plus Fearless Advantage power combo would obliterate even the spongy Exensia if he engaged her. Once again, I had a priority target I had to kill with my Wyrmlings before I sent in my giant bird. But I also realized how important Kelda was to kill this game. Charos and Heracles have 9 and 8 lives respectively, giving Kelda plenty of room to heal them before they die. And so, my order of kill priorities became Kelda, Heracles, and Charos. Any army where Charos is the least of your worries is a mean army indeed. My Wyrmlings opened again and began attacking where they could. The blue Wyrmling's Lightning Breath attack gave them the occasional ranged attack. I don't remember it doing much against Charos or Heracles, but it was nice to still attack even as they developed. My opponent kept Kelda in his start zone, but the way the map was laid out made hitting her with Lightning Breath fairly easy. And with her average defense, lightning attacks occasionally got through. Kelda went down fairly quickly, but I still had 2 absolute monsters to kill. This was another match I was glad I brought Black Wyrmlings to. I recall them doing a few auto wounds on Heracles, since he is a medium-sized figure. I forget if Heracles picked up any treasure glyphs during that game, but he was punching and throwing his way through my wormlings quickly. But they too were doing a lot of damage into him. Charos was stalking the skirmish nearby, but he still wasn't my immediate concern. Eventually, Heracles fell, but in his wake was a field strewn with wormling carcasses. I think I had 1 or 2 left, but it was really up to Exentia to deal with Charos. What I do recall was Exentia grabbing at least 1 treasure glyph. I think it might have been an attack buffing glyph, but I'm not sure. Either way, with her positioning flexibility, auto-wound powers, and her high life count, Jandar's mighty phoenix narrowly outlasted the great Ular dragon in their duel. That matchup stressed me out the whole way through, and I was glad to have overcome, but the day was far from over. Game 4. As tends to happen whenever we go to an event together, I faced off against Sammy, sporting the army he and I discussed in the days prior to the event. He ran a ninja build composed of Isamu, Moriko, Shiori, and the VC hero Kantono Daishi, who acts as the ninja's leader. But much more worryingly, Sammy had also brought the terrifying VC behemoth, Brancephus. Sammy had been longing to run this gigantic powerhouse unit ever since he got the figure, and since he spent the night at my place the night before we carpooled to the event, I helped superglue Brancephus to his base. The furious Cyclops was fresh and ready to rumble, and I was very worried I wouldn't have much to deal with him within my army. Sammy opened with Kantono and his ninjas while I opened with my wormlings. Our 2 forces converged on the center of the map where the treasure glyphs were present. It was clear Sammy was saving Brancephus for the endgame, a terrifying prospect. But maybe I could deal with him if I dispatched Kantono and his ninjas quickly without incurring too many losses on my end. In a stroke of luck, that's what happened. I forget if it was Exentia or a wormling, but I managed to get the jump on Kantono with a height attack, killing the shadowy master ninja with several unrevealed order markers on his card. This gave me several turns to develop and attack without Sammy retaliating, and my forces quickly finished off the remaining ninja. This was another matchup where black wormlings came in handy, as their acid breath struck down the otherwise slippery Isamu with ease. Now Exentia and her remaining wormlings had to face down Brancephus. Exentia was fortunately able to take in the treasure glyphs on the map before Bram arrived, charging her up for the inevitable duel. The last few wormlings softened Bram up before he engaged Exentia and the true battle began. Bram is similar to Krug in that his offensive power goes up the more wounded he is, but Exentia had the stamina to outlast his attacks. It was close, but Exentia eventually took the mighty Cyclops down. Another win for the day. Game 5. I believe at this stage of the day our event entered the playoff phase. I had recovered enough of my score from my first loss that day to qualify for the playoffs, and I believe the first playoff game pitted me against yet another Q9 army. This was a very tanky army, made up of Q9, Old Raylin, and Siege, plus a Sahuagin Raider for filler. Our map had lava on both sides, and a single hex of elevation in the center. In my first game that day, I failed to get through Q9's base 7 defense. Within Raylin's aura, that defense would become 9. So I had to find a way to take out Raylin, and then hope I could eventually get through that still strong 7 defense. I opened again with my wormlings. The black wormlings once again turned out to be a good draft for this battle, with Siege and Raylin as 2 important medium figures to take out. As Siege approached my figures, I realized that if he got onto that single hex elevation in the center, then he could activate Crag of Steel and attack everyone adjacent to him from on height, making his defense 8 and his attack 4. I had to prevent that from happening. Fortunately, my wormlings outpaced both him and Q9 with their flying. It would take Siege a long time to get to that single hex elevation, so with that problem temporarily delayed, I decided to focus on dealing with Q9. I forget if my opponent kept Q9 within Raylin's aura during this part of the game, though I think she did, but Q9 had moved up underneath 2 hexes of height. Granted, those height spaces were lava tiles, but nevertheless, I knew I had to take the opportunity. I rushed in 2 blue wormlings on my next order marker to engage Q9 on height before he could move up to claim it. The wormlings dropped 2 attacks of 5 in that turn and rolled hot on each. My opponent's rolls were poor on that turn, and although Q9 didn't die, he took several wounds. Still, the height was mine, and even on Q9's next turn, as soon as he shot down a blue wormling, another from nearby came in and filled the spot. On my next turn, I put out 2 more attacks of 5 from 2 blue wormlings. I forget how many turns this duel lasted, but the blue wormlings did it. Q9 fell, and my opponent was left with only Siege, Raylin, and the Sahuagin Raider. Siege was far enough away from Raylan that he wasn't receiving her buff, and I had my Wyrmlings fly over and start zapping him with lightning and engaging him in melee where possible. I believe Siege took most of them out, but he too was eventually overwhelmed and fell. From there, it was pretty much Exensia versus Raylan and the Sahuagin Raider, and the Phoenix made short work of both. I took the win and advanced in the playoffs. If I could win my next game, I would qualify for the championship match. Game 6. The next playoff game I entered was against an army I'd heard lots of chatter about that day but had yet to face. It was an elf-wizard build composed of Arkmer, Chardris, Jordan, Quintela Gwyn, Morsbane, Ulganesh, and Otanashi as filler. This was a perfect army for the heroes-only format. While certainly synergistic and potentially very strong, it's an army that can get easily overwhelmed by large volumes of squad figures due to its low volume of activations per turn and the relatively low defense of the elf wizards in general. But squads weren't appearing in this event, and most other armies had similar number of activations per turn compared to the elves. So even though opponents could get through the elves' low defense to chip away at their life counts, they would only do so very slowly, making the entire elf army very spongy and durable in this format. Little wonder the elves had gotten this far that day. A figure I was particularly worried about was Morsbane. One good shot from his Rod of Negation and my Exensia could lose all of her incredible powers, or even die. If either outcome happened, I would probably lose the game. One note of comfort was that Emerune wasn't in the elf army. Though he's not regarded as the best value for points compared to other elves in classic points, he went down 15 points in VC Delta at the time of this video. And if my opponent brought Emerune and rolled hot on the d20, that would have allowed for mass development of the elves to set them up into a pod on a strategic position on the map, something this build likes doing. But without Emerune, my opponent's army would be slower to develop. He still had Ulganesh, the glue that makes the elf-wizard army possible, and I would have to cut through a combined 29 lives worth of figures across my opponent's army. As impressive as Exensia's effective 12 lives were, if you add my 10 Wyrmlings and Ball, that only put me at 23 hit points across my army, as it were. So my opponent was ahead of me on sheer stamina. However this went down, it was going to be a slog. What I did have over my opponent was mobility, and I opened as usual with my Wyrmlings. They quickly crossed the board and developed onto height, just outside my opponent's start zone. While he was slowly developing his elves, he wasn't able to get far out of his start before my Wyrmlings started hitting him with lightning and acid attacks. It's here where I made the biggest mistake of the game. Despite how much I feared Morsbane, I thought he'd probably only get 1 or 2 chances to hit my Exensia with Rod of Negation, and since the roll was unlikely, I could reasonably gamble on it not happening. Because of this, I had my Wyrmlings focus on Quintela Gwyn, who provided both a defense buff to adjacent elves, as well as buffs to the powers and special attacks of Arkmer, Chardris, and Jordan. My thinking was she'd be easy to kill, and killing her would remove some important buffs to the other elves. But she lasted much, much longer than I would have liked, and during that time, my opponent was killing more Wyrmlings than I had hoped would be dead by that early point in the game. As my Wyrmlings were approaching their last few figures, I decided it was time to bring in Exensia. This was earlier than I would have liked to mobilize her, but since my opponent's figures were still clumped together in his start zone, I figured if I could move Exensia into their midst, I could potentially do major damage to all of his elves with her immolation and explosion powers. However, Morsbane was still alive, in fact with most of his hit points still left. I began praying that my gamble would pay off. As Exensia approached the elf formation, my opponent activated Ulganesh and used his Mind Link to select 2 elf wizards to activate. Previously, he had been mostly activating Arkmer, Chardris, or Jordan, his main offensive elves. But as soon as Exensia was in range, my opponent activated Morsbane and took a shot with Rod of Negation. First roll, he rolled a 16, just enough to trigger the negation. This was a colossal blunder on my part. Not only were all of Exensia's powers negated, but because her Phoenix Rising power was negated, Exensia couldn't explode and couldn't be reborn after explosion. My opponent effectively halved Exensia's life count in one shot with negation. It was a major blow, and my odds of winning this match dropped significantly. I still played my hardest. Exensia picked up at least 1 treasure glyph and killed a good few remaining elves. But when she died, my opponent still had Ulganesh, healthy and in a good position. All I had was Ball. And while Ball might get lucky with an ankle shank, it was pretty clear the game was over. I played Ball as hard as I could, as the Goblin Rogue had pulled off wonders for me in the past. But Ulganesh's mobility and range had my boy beat. Ball was shot dead before he could engage, and I lost the game. In losing, I was knocked out of the championship, and my opponent got a well-deserved advancement to the big game of the day. But I still qualified for the game that would determine 3rd and 4th place. Game 7. My 7th game that day was also my last competitive game not only of the day, but of 2023, and fitfully, it was against my man Sammy, who also qualified for the 3rd and 4th place game. If our last tournament was any predictor, we would leave this tournament with even number of matches won against each other, and since I had beaten him earlier that day, it seemed a matter of prophecy that I would lose this one. But I still gathered my forces for the battle for 3rd place. Our map was wide open with an elevated hill in the center and treasure glyphs off to the sides. As we did in our last game together that day, I opened with my wormlings, and Sammy opened with his ninjas. I recall his ninjas securing the treasure glyphs early, the two that match being the Heroic Rune and Talisman of Defense, granting their holders +1 attack and +1 defense respectively. As the battle progressed, Sammy's ninjas were dispatching my wormlings with surprising ease. So I brought in Exensia to help turn things around. Unfortunately, as a Jandar hero, Exensia was vulnerable to Isamu's dishonorable attack, so that cheap filler ninja got frustratingly high attacks in on her. Still, Exensia briefly turned the tide and took out the ninjas. I believe one of the ninjas, possibly Cantono, had grabbed both treasure glyphs, and so once dead, that single-spaced figure could only drop one of the glyphs. Smartly, Sammy chose to drop the Talisman of Defense. Certainly helpful, but not as helpful as the Heroic Rune would have been, which I was probably going to need for what was to come. With the ninjas dead, the mighty Bram Cephas began moving up. He was a few turns away from reaching me, and Exensia picked up the Talisman of Defense during the downtime. Slightly bulkier for it, the Phoenix and the Cyclops soon engaged for their rematch. But even with her extra defense, Bram Cephas handily defeated her. I believe she put a few wounds in on him, leaving Tiny Ball alone against the towering one-eyed menace. I believe Ball got a single chance to ankle shank Bram, and failed. The next turn, Bram ruthlessly stomped Ball into a pulp. Little guy didn't stand a chance. And so, as the prophecy foretold, Sammy beat me that game, meaning our scores against each other for 2023 were tied. He took 3rd place and I took 4th, and won my own Cantono Daishi figure as a prize. And with that, my first year of competitive Heroscape came to a close. Takeaways and conclusion. So, what did I learn from this final event? My biggest takeaway by far was my stupidity in my game against the elves. I had a real shot at winning that, and making it to the championship, but I bet my whole game on an idiotic and completely unnecessary gamble with Morsbane's Rod of Negation. What frustrates me in looking back on my performance was the fact that my Blue Wormling's Lightning Breath attack, a pretty weak attack that I don't expect much out of, nevertheless was enough to get through Morsbane's poor defense of 2. And my opponent didn't even position Morsbane adjacent to Quintella Gwyn, so it was the perfect opportunity to go after him. I didn't even need to be in immediate range of Morsbane. I could have stood back with my Blue Wormlings and target an elf in the front of the grouping, then arc my lightning over to hit Morsbane on each attack. Why I went for Quintella Gwyn over such a juicy target prior to Exensia's mobilization bewilders me to this day. It was a reminder of the wisdom of planning for the worst, especially with D20 powers. It's true that Heroscape can reward big risky plays at times, and indeed has some units specifically designed around those sorts of moves. But there was no need for me to put myself at the mercy of my opponent's D20 rolls on Rod of Negation. I shouldn't have ever given him the chance to roll for it. If I played assuming Morsbane was certain to get his Rod of Negation, then maybe I would have made him a higher priority target in my mind. I knew going into that game he was going to be dangerous. I just didn't fully appreciate it once things got rolling, and spent my precious early turns attacking a cheap filler unit in Quintella Gwyn. I deserved that defeat, and my opponent deserved the win. He built a strong army and played it well. Another lesson that day was how to build an army when treasure glyphs are present. Overall, I thought my army was fairly well-rounded and had good answers to a variety of matchups that day. But we were placing treasure glyphs in spots where power glyphs were called for on the maps, which meant that the treasure glyphs were often on opposite sides of the map. Part of my reason for drafting Exensia was so I could have one big powerful unit run around the map grabbing treasure glyphs, if the opportunities to pick them up arose. But she was my main unique hero, with the core of my army being smaller common heroes. That meant I only had one really viable option to picking up treasure glyphs at any one time. All of the armies I fought that day had multiple unique heroes, who could spread out and potentially pick up 2 or more treasure glyphs on a map at roughly the same time, thus putting all of the glyphs into the control of their army. So, while I was impressed with Exensia's performance as the big hero of my army, Her being the only unique hero made it difficult for me to control the treasure glyphs. Well, I guess I had Ball too. Maybe that was the real lesson of the day. I should have put more faith in Ball. Had I sent him out to pick up the treasure glyphs earlier, I'd probably break the entire game of Heroscape. Lesson learned. And finally, to end on a positive note, I was ultimately glad I brought along 2 black wormlings as my specialists. 2 was just the right amount for the occasional high defense medium figure such as Nigaxa. Surprisingly, Sammy's Kantono Daishi was also a good target for black wormling gas attacks, as he had high defense and acid breath bypassing his counterstrike power. Blue wormlings did feel like the right call for my main foot soldiers. Their high attacks downed to Q9 that day, and their lightning breath gave them the occasional ranged attack opportunity. All in all, another delightful day of Heroscape, and a wonderful way to round out 2023. Final score, 4 wins, 3 losses. Alright, and we now come to the off-the-cuff outro part of the video, where I go off script and provide some channel updates, direction forward for the channel, all that good stuff. But before we do that, I want to go over the cumulative score of all of the tournaments that I attended in 2023, all combined together into one big score. So, final score for all the games I went to in 2023 is 26 wins, 12 losses, and 1 incredible draw. This is down from 27 wins I initially had, but we knocked one down on the Firestorm tournament because I couldn't find proof of that 5th win. So in any case, just to be on the safe side, we're just going to say 26 wins, 12 losses, 1 draw. That is the cumulative score of 2023. And if anyone is interested about my ongoing tournament scores from 23 onward, I am keeping track of them on my channel's About section. You'll see a cumulative score. It's updated with each tournament I attend, so it's actually gone up a little bit. Both my losses and my wins have been updated. No new draws. I doubt I'll ever get another draw again in the rest of my life, but never know. And yeah, so if you're interested in following my progress on any tournaments I go to after 2023, you can check the About page on the channel for updates on that. Now, regarding this video, unless this video does insanely well, I don't expect I'm ever going to do something like this again. I really just meant this video to be a one-time deal, kind of commemorating my first year of competitive Heroscape. Never in my life prior to this did I think I'd actually be going to Heroscape tournaments. I didn't realize there were Heroscapers in my area, and but I was put in touch to the West Coast SoCal group that I'm now a part of by Sir Heroscape, one of the most prominent YouTube Heroscapers, and Sir Heroscape, I doubt you're watching this, but if you are, I really appreciate it. And it's connected me with a really great group of people, and I have yet to meet a Heroscape player that I don't enjoy playing against. It's a really wholesome, friendly, inviting, and sportsman-like community, and you guys are great. You're all champs, and appreciate you big time. And special thanks also to our tournament organizers, in particular in our group, Kobe, doubt you're watching this, but if you are, man, hey, really appreciate you. So there are tournament threads on the Heroscapist forums to help you guys find the right region or a tournament, a competitive Heroscape group near you. There's ways to find that on the Heroscapers forums. I didn't think there'd be one near me, but lo and behold, there was. So it always is worthwhile looking, and I strongly recommend it. Even if you don't win every game, hey man, you learn about the game and you have a lot of fun. It's a great day out, and yeah, just pick up your dice, get rolling, and I can't recommend it enough. So anyway, I don't anticipate doing more of these tournament style videos. This is just a one-time commemoration of 2023. But if you guys really do like it, then I can start considering taking notes. I just, for the past couple tournaments I've been to, I haven't been taking notes, so I'd have to start fresh with the new year. But anyway, that's all. That's neither here nor there. So anyway. After this video, we still have the tier list to do. Rest assured that I am still working on those. The next one will be for Wave 2, Utgar's Rage. This is of Classic Heroscape. And then for the VC videos, where these are just kind of one-off videos covering a single unit from Valhalla Customs, I initially ran a poll after I did the Big Face Sneak video, where I said, do you guys prefer to have them as single videos covering a single unit, or would you like them as a one long video covering an entire wave? And the winner of the poll was one video for one unit. So it's going to be roughly 15-20 minute videos covering a single unit in each wave of VC. Right now we're in the SOV Wave 1. That's all the releases in 2011 to 2013. That began with the Beak Face Sneaks. We're going to go down in order alphabetically. And so what we'll do is, after I complete a wave, after I do an analysis of each unit in a wave, I will compile them together into a single long video, and I'll save that video, and that video then I'll upload to the channel. So, you know, if you listen to these things on your commute or while you're cleaning your house or whatever, you'll have both the option to listen to them individually as single videos, plus as one giant video once we complete a wave. So hopefully that makes both camps happy on that poll. And then, as I said, the tier lists are still in the works. And I guess the other thing is the idea of the Pet Armies series that I proposed earlier in this video. And that would be where I spend time analyzing, rather than a specific unit, we're analyzing a build, which would compose of multiple units. So I mentioned 2 already that I have in mind. That would be the Bees and Mellifera, and then also Torkulna and the Grubs. So those are 2 armies that I really enjoy and I have a lot of experience with. So I feel like I could, you know, there's certain discoveries I've made about those armies and how to play them kind of at a, I don't want to say a higher level, I don't know if that sounds pretentious or whatever, but like, I've played them a lot. They're some of my favorite armies, and I feel like the more you play something, the more you begin to see little subtleties in play that can, you know, make your game a little bit better. So anyway, if that sounds like something of interest, be happy to do it. And then later on, you know, if that series takes off and you guys have a specific build you want me to cover that I don't have experience with, then I can, you know, get the figures for that build together, play a couple games, understanding that build, build my own understanding of that build, and then I can share my findings in a video, in another episode on that. So there's definitely a way that we can incorporate viewer requests into that series as well. But let me know if a Pet Armies or, you know, army builds analysis video series sounds interesting, and we'll add that to the list. But yes, I want to make sure that long videos like this video took a very long time to edit, and I don't want this video to take away from the other main series, that being the tier lists, the VC analysis videos. And I really do, even though the VC video didn't do as well as some of my other ones, I do still want to do that series because VC needs love, and I think I want to promote it. You know, these are great units. The people who design VC are they have added tremendously to the Heroscape canon, and I want to make sure that the word gets out there about VC, because I think a lot of people who are getting back into Heroscape aren't aware that there's this whole other world of Heroscape available to them. So I've posted a link in the description to learn about VC, the VC website. It'll show you all the units, and yeah, it's a great side of Heroscape, and I highly recommend it. So anyway, that's the big picture for things in the future of this channel. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. What else can I say? It is a great time to be a Heroscaper. Age of Annihilation has brought it back. Official Heroscape is back, and these are bright days indeed for our community. So anyway, folks, thank you all for watching. Hope you guys have a great rest of the week, and y'all take care. And as always, scape on.